So apparently something that I've got to start this off with to get rid of a misconception is I am not actually sitting on any books right now. I am actually on the floor. Apparently a lot of people don't realize how the book throne is constructed. It's really just armrests and some support for the back. Now that that's out of the way, I get to finally add my channel to the growing list of people that are critiquing Colleen Hoover, and specifically we're going after her book, November 9. Colleen Hoover has become one of the most prolific authors on Book Talk and is exceedingly popular there to the point where a number of her books are on various bestsellers lists. Now, I'm not going to begrudge her success. She's got a lot of fans who are apparently called cohorts. And if I'm being honest, I will have a few compliments to send her because she's not a terrible author, she just writes about terrible people. If this video is going to give any kind of a real lesson, it's about the importance of preconceived notions. Because if you go into any kind of artwork, a book, a movie, a video game, whatever, with the intent of finding fault with it, then your review is going to be tainted by that mindset. You're not going to be able to really judge the medium by any kind of real balanced metrics. It might be entertaining, it might be fun, but your review is going to have kind of an asterisk on it in my perspective, because you've got to be able to balance the objective and the subjective, the structure of the work as well as the artistry. And that's how I try to judge a lot of stories when I get into them. You have two main skill sets that I like to focus on in a lot of my videos. You've got the technical skills of how a book is composed, and these are your more objective points like syntax, grammar, pacing, etc. But then you have the more artistic elements, your character work, world building, the way that elements are introduced and blend together. And I am not ashamed to say Colleen Hoover has excellent technical skills. There's a lot of structural things that the book does very well. With like one exception, there really aren't a lot of blatant errors. The problem comes down to pretty much everything that requires an artistic lens. The characters that Hoover uses are, at best, forgettable. And that's like a lot of the side characters, once they're off the page, have so little impact on anything that occurs. The two main characters in this book, Ben and Fallon, are not the worst couple I've ever read about, but by the end, you're probably going to hate them. This is a romance between a crying doormat and a neckbeard Reddit moderator. Hoover has the skill set to be a talented writer, she just chooses not to be one. Now, like I said, a lot of people have been going after Hoover's books lately and rightfully critiquing a lot of what she writes about. But I had to be very careful stepping into this project because I didn't want to walk in and instantly hate everything that she had to say. So this isn't going to be me proclaiming that this is the worst romance story ever, especially because after is still a thing. The book actually starts out pretty effectively. It sort of starts out moderately well, plateaus for a little while, and then when you get about to the halfway point of the book, it starts descending in quality and the characters' chemistry just never recovers. It's a sink all the way down for the rest of the book. But speaking of after, guess who wrote a positive review on the back of the book? Anna Todd! November 9 is yet another breathtaking novel by Colleen Hoover that's full of blushing, gushing, and heartache. I loved every page and breathed in every beautiful word. A book getting a positive comment from Anna Todd is like a bank getting a positive comment from Jim Cramer. But anyway, what's this story about? Well, this is a romance, and I'm gonna have to keep repeating that point throughout the review because this is not written like a normal romance. I've given some seemingly positive comments on the book, like it showed some promise before, and that's because it turns out I read this wrong. Maybe it's because I've been reading too many dark romances lately, like 50 Shades or 365 Days, but going through this, the book doesn't read like a traditional romance. There are certain rules that you would expect within the romantic genre that this book does not follow. This reads much more like a thriller. The story is about Fallon, who 2 years ago was in a very bad house fire and now has this massive scar running down the left side of her body. She was an up-and-coming actress. The fire pretty much ruined that, so now she's going over to New York from California to try her luck at Broadway to see maybe if she can get some acting gigs over there. And while she's discussing this plan with her father over lunch, Ben overhears that, and he's quite smitten with her and decides that maybe there's something to this girl. Starts chatting with her. They kind of hit it off pretty quickly, and well, I mean, they can't stay together. She already has an apartment lined up in New York. She's got plane tickets for later that night. Well, they decide that this somehow makes for a good premise for a book, and it just so happens that Ben is an aspiring writer. Not a very good one, but more on that later. So they decide to mimic the events of the 1978 classic Same Time Next Year, where these two have a secret relationship where they meet up once a year and have no contact with each other throughout the rest of the year. And they meet on November 9th. But very much in the tradition of Nicholas Sparks, something is wrong. There's a deep, dark secret from their pasts that they're trying to hide, and that rears its ugly head and drama ensues. It might take a little bit to get to the really bad parts of this book because, like I said, it kind of plateaus at the beginning, and most of my compliments will be in the first half of this book. But eventually, I get to eviscerate this crap. This has one of the most confounding endings of any romance I've ever come across. I promise, it gets stupid. It gets very stupid. Also, brief tangent for some books I can actually recommend, because I think this is part of the reason why I read this as a thriller. Because those are some of the books that I've been reading lately. First up, you've got The Perfect Girlfriend by Karen Hamilton, and I loved this book. This is the story of Juliet, who's in love with her boyfriend Nate, and she wants to do everything that she can to make his life easier, make his life happier. He works as a pilot, so he's always darting all over the place, crazy schedule. It's a difficult relationship, but she's willing to put in the work to make it function. And this book is wonderful because you get such a great introduction in the first chapter when Juliet goes to Nate's apartment. He's going to be swinging by later that day, and she wants to make him happy. She likes seeing him smile. So she goes to his apartment and tidies it up a little bit, restocks the fridge, gives him I believe like a favorite set of cookies or something, just to leave on the counter as a nice little treat. She's very caring in that regard. Until you get to the end of the chapter, and Juliet points out that Nate has a temporary fear of commitment. She just has to be patient with him. He'll come around to his senses someday. And she also has a phone alarm reminding her that it's time to leave because she can't be seen in the apartment when Nate shows up. Hamilton does a beautiful job of framing the situation from Juliet's perspective so that she is this loving, doting girlfriend. When the reader gets the full picture, oh no, she's a crazy stalker. It is such clever framing. You start this book because the prose is very inviting, and you keep reading it because Juliet's plan throughout the book to get Nate to come to his senses is so elaborate, but so addicting. She is a full-on psycho. I loved this book. And the other one is The Wives by Taryn Fisher. And this one was a bit different. It starts out with Thursday, and she's called so because that is the day of the week that she gets to see her husband. You see, her husband is a polygamist, but an unusual sort in which the wives are not allowed to actually contact each other. It's weird, but Thursday doesn't really care. She's got enough love to go around for her man, and she'll put up with it. And she thinks she's okay with this arrangement until her husband gets a third wife, and Thursday realizes that she's not really as happy with this arrangement as she thought she was, and curiosity gets the better of her, especially when she finds a note in her husband's jacket with the third wife's actual name. So Thursday tries to track this third wife down and finds her out, like outside of a Starbucks. And then she notices the bruises. And it really gets you wondering, what kind of a husband is this guy? Is Thursday safe? What is this situation? And it keeps you glued, constantly guessing what's going on until the very last chapter. Wonderfully done stuff. But the key difference between these books and November 9th is that you understand what's going on here. Like, Stalker Lady, dangerous situation, that's not actually good. And they're framed as bad situations. November 9th, as we will get through in the second half, you realize that the situation is actually very, very bad. But just like the disaster that is after, the author doesn't realize the image that she is creating. This is a very dangerous, toxic relationship. And this one, oh boy. Now, the one thing I was looking forward to saying about Hoover is that she is a pretty non-controversial author. She doesn't really have a lot going about her in her background. I was looking forward to saying that, and then I actually did some research. Colleen Hoover started her writing career in 2011 when she was working as a vacuum lady for the FBI. And if you got that joke, congratulations on being my kind of nerd. No, so Hoover started writing in 2011, published her first story in 2012, and has been pumping books out constantly ever since. As of recording, she has published 24 novels and multiple novellas. She has actually published an additional 3 books since this video started. In that way, she's like the romance version of Brandon Sanderson, except Sanderson understands fantasy writing and magic systems on an academic level, and Hoover writes about boys who get the girl when they should get the chair. I have made it no secret that I do not like Nick Sparks as an author. I don't think he's very talented, and I think that he is the most formulaic writer I can name, more so even than Dan Brown. But if I've got to give him any compliments, at least in regards to romance, at least his characters are likable. Cannot say the same for this. November 9th is actually kind of unique in that there was a scene that had to be edited after the initial edition came out. There's a moment about a little more than halfway through the story where Ben confronts Fallon in a nightclub, kind of pins her against the wall, and his hands start wandering a little bit, and she says stop, and he doesn't. Unfortunately, the scene, as it was originally, like from what I've been able to glean, I don't have that edition, but from what I've been able to glean, it was framed as a your mouth says no, but your body says yes sort of a thing, so that's gross. The scene has since been watered down, but you can tell where the changes have been made. Oh, and then there was the coloring book incident with It Ends With Us, one of her other stories. So, adult coloring books seem to be growing in popularity. Okay, I've got a friend who actually works on them. Does some pretty good artwork. And I guess Hoover decided to jump on board with that with one of her stories. Sensible. She already owns the property, and I'm sure that there are a number of scenes that she'd be able to lift quite easily in order to make possibly wonderful stuff for art. Except, It Ends With Us deals a lot with domestic violence. And a lot of people thought that that was in very poor taste. Hoover eventually got in contact with the publishers and said, hey, maybe we shouldn't do this. And the book never got, it got pulled and never actually got published. But you'd have to wonder, why wouldn't you think of that beforehand? That seems like a bad idea. It's like a Law and Order Special Victims Unit coloring book. Maybe no? Oh, and then there's the matter with her son, who was accused on social media of sexually assaulting a minor, like a 16-year-old, I think she was. And for legal purposes, I will say accused of, never actually, I don't believe it went to court. So I'm not saying the guy did it, but apparently Hoover offered an apology and said that she was going to work on the situation. Made an apology video that has apparently been removed from her original Facebook post. So take that as you will. Now, it is going to take a little while to get to the really juicy bits, but some of the initial character work is quite troubling, and I think you'll understand why I accidentally read this as a thriller. But remember, this is supposed to be a romance. But first, has this ever happened to you?
Hello, I have been a good boy, and I would like one food, please. Okay, one food. That will be a bunch of money. But I only have one money. If only my phone bill wasn't so high. Oh no! Oh no!
Yes, phone bills are one of those unfortunate facets of life that seem unreasonably expensive sometimes. It's part of the reason why I used a flip phone for as long as I have. Which is why I'm glad to say that for this video, we're partnering with Mint Mobile. You may be familiar with Mint Mobile because of the commercial starring its owner, Ryan Reynolds, using a budget that I can only dream of. In case you're not familiar with Mint Mobile, the big thing about them is their very low costs. As opposed to other mobile carriers who will charge you over $100 a month, Mint Mobile only charges you about $15 a month. And the way they reliably keep prices down is because they've minimized infrastructure. They don't have any brick and mortar stores they have to upkeep. And you may be worried, okay, so they've minimized some of their infrastructure, but obviously they've had to sacrifice service. Well, actually no, they haven't. They're paired up with the largest 5G network in America, and the service is impeccable. Now, I'm not about to take on a channel partner or a sponsor without checking it out first to make sure that you guys aren't getting ripped off, which is why I'm proud to say I've been with Mint Mobile for about 4 months now. Mint even sells phones on their website, and I've been using this Galaxy S20, not the most up-to-date, but that's by my choice. And I like my new phone. It actually does everything I need of it. It plays YouTube or Audible when I'm at work or commuting. Hotspots, web browsing, all sorts of stuff. Phone calls, obviously. I honestly don't really have any complaints about service. This has actually been a very reliable phone. And switching to Mint was actually very easy. The whole process might have taken me 15 to 20 minutes. That includes buying a new phone. But if you don't want to get a new phone, if you want to just keep whatever phone you're using right now, that's fine. Mint actually has a digital SIM program that allows you to switch using your current phone. That's assuming it's compatible, of course, because that's not always the case. Now, you may be thinking $15 a month is really down there, so there's probably some sort of a catch. Maybe it's not part of their unlimited package, so you'll run out of data. Technically, that is true. The unlimited package is a little more expensive, at $30 a month. Really not that much. But now it's even better because there is a limited time offer. That $30 is 50% off. So if you act fast, you'll be able to get Mint for only $15 a month with their unlimited package. To get started, use the link in the description of the video. You'll be doing a lot to help out the channel. Or if you've already made the switch, go ahead and mention it in the comments. Do it so you can afford to give your puppy more treats.
I like food.
And now back to reviewing a terrible book. So one thing I like when authors do well is when they open up the book with an appropriate quote to help set the mood for what we're about to get into. It can make the introductory experience that much more compelling or rich and rewarding. What Hoover does for every one of these new Novembers, because we've got the 1st November, the 9th, the 2nd, the 3rd, every one of these gets a new poem or bit of writing excerpt. And I'm not crazy about them. I am translucent, aquatic, drifting, aimless. She is an anchor sinking in my sea. Benton James Kessler. Now, a number of you might be wondering, who the hell is Benton James Kessler? I've never heard of him before. It's Ben, the male love interest from the story. I don't like it when authors pull from their own material to write something like this because it tells me that you couldn't find something else that was poignant to include like this. And on top of that, the poem itself is nonsense. Ben here is the sea, and Fallon is an anchor sinking into it. So either she's in free fall or she's anchoring somebody else. This is one of those things where the image is probably there in Hoover's head, but she didn't communicate it very well. So there's a plethora of different interpretations that one could have for a poem, which normally could be a good thing because there are a lot of discussions that you could have about the meaning and depth of a poem at that point. The problem is they're not having a discussion. Like, I don't feel people would have a discussion on the various interpretations that one could have of this poem. I think they'd have discussions about how they don't fully understand what's going on with this image. If you really want an example of how indirect and how indecipherable the actual meaning of this poem is, here's a theory. It's about pegging. And I'm sure as we go throughout the rest of these, people are going to have a whole myriad of different whatever interpretations of whatever this is supposed to be. Like, all of these poems, because they're all a mess. But then we get to the book proper, and I've got to give credit where it's due. This is a very good opening line. I wonder what kind of sound it would make if I were to smash this glass against the side of his head. Okay, that grabs your attention. A proper hook, as I've said before, will grab your attention and have you asking questions. Those are the absolute best sorts of openings to a book. And this manages to accomplish both. We've got a very violent image that immediately leads to all sorts of questions. Presumably, this is Fallon talking, because it's her at the mentioned at the top of the page. Like, who is she thinking about attacking? Why? What did this other person do? And as the rest of this first page opens up, we get a slow introduction to what this scene is. Fallon is stabbing an ice cube with a straw, imagining that it's the other person's head. There are napkins around, so presumably they're in a restaurant of some sort. We started in the middle of their conversation where the other person, it's a guy, is shocked that something is happening, and Fallon doesn't feel like congratulating him. It's a good, slow introduction to the scene to drip in these little elements so that we can connect what's going on without directly saying they're in a restaurant. Again, I think that's good. Hoover sets us a clear image of what's going on and never has to be overtly direct about it, at least not at first. It's very similar to the opening to The Bad Guys, which I thought had one of the strongest openings out of anything DreamWorks has ever put out.
But I mean, come on, everybody loves birthdays. You got decorations, you got balloons, you got parties, and cake.
Look, I don't need presents. I don't want decorations, and I'm not a cake guy.
Seriously, though, you don't like cake? Name one food better than cake.
Guinea pig?
And then, unfortunately, a lot of this enthusiasm dies when you get to the second page and you start getting into some of the dialogue. Dialogue is absolutely Hoover's Achilles heel. A good part of the reason that her characters don't come off well is because they don't speak like people do. Case in point. So the other person Fallon's talking to is her father, and he's happy because his now fiancée is apparently pregnant, and he's like, oh, this is such a wonderful, happy thing for me again. I'm gonna have another kid. And she doesn't take this well. He shrugs, and a smug smile takes over his already irritating expression. I didn't know I had it in me to become a father again. A loud burst of disbelieving laughter escapes my mouth. Releasing sperm into the vagina of a 24-year-old does not a father make, I say somewhat bitterly. Yeah. Now, you're not always going to have your dialogue just hit it out of the park. Oftentimes, you just want good, basic dialogue in order to continue the story and establish character. So you don't need to worry about getting everything exactly right. It just needs to function. The problem is, this doesn't function. This takes you out of the moment because it sounds so awkward. And a good portion of the dialogue throughout the rest of the book will do exactly the same. Now, while I did like the intro to this book, unfortunately, Hoover runs out of ways to really provide exposition in a very clear way, and so she starts being very direct with it. So not only does Fallon's father come out and say, I'm your father, he also says that the reason that his wife divorced him is, your mother left me because I slept with her best friend. My personality had nothing to do with it. And again, going back to the Bad Guys opening scene, the conversation that you have between Mr. Wolf and Mr. Snake has so many small elements that reveal character. It is a very smartly written scene. And at no point do they actually have to be overt about what they're talking about. This is all a casual conversation between friends, and it never appears as anything else. And when you can have a scene that is written that well so that you can provide all of that information without ever once grabbing the audience by the neck and saying, hey, listen, this is important, then you're doing some next level writing. So to emphasize what I said at the beginning, Hoover is very talented when it comes to the technical aspects of her writing, but when it comes to artistically introducing elements or character work, she completely fumbles. And that's without talking about how superficial some of the characters are. For example, in response to her father talking about his divorce, Fallon thinks, "I don't even know what to say to that. The man has absolutely zero remorse. I both hate and envy it. In a way, I wish I were more like him and less like my mother. He's oblivious to his many flaws, whereas mine are the focal point of my life. My flaws are what wake me up in the morning and what keep me awake every night." We don't quite know what she's talking about at this point. We're going to get to that in a little bit. But unfortunately, it is a very shallow take on the scars that the fire left behind on her. At no point is she talking about deeper character flaws, bad behaviors, bad decisions that she makes, and she makes a number of them throughout the story. But this sounds like Fallon is supposed to be hypercritical about who and what she is, and she's really, really not. So this sends an incorrect image of this character, and that's without discussing the wider aspect of writing a character who is supposed to be aware of flaws. This comes down to biases and blind spots. As an author, you have to be hypercritical about everything, and you have to see your characters through their perspectives as opposed to what you see their perspectives being, if that makes sense. For example, if Hoover is not aware of any extra flaws that Fallon has, then this entire perspective stops making sense as you finish the book. Part of the problem in Hoover's writing process, though, seems to be that she's just focused on getting books out too quickly, so she never takes the time to actually settle in and try to see things from her character's perspectives. These are perspectives that they are either very unaware of or they don't follow through to completion, so the book has a much more shallow read as a result. So the food finally gets delivered and the waiter starts fanboying because it turns out that Fallon's father is Donovan O'Neill, who played Max Epcot on some show from like 10 years ago. And now he's kind of a bum, so feel free to read him as BoJack Horseman.
Oh my God, he's got a gun!
Relax, it's a lighter. How much lighter fluid can I take on the plane? And before you answer, remember I'm a celebrity.
The waiter asks for a selfie, and this gives Fallon an excuse to get up and go to the bathroom and just deliver more exposition. I read a study on bacteria in public restrooms once. The first stall in every bathroom studied was found to have the least amount of bacteria. People assume the first stall is the most utilized, so most people skip over it. Not me. It's the only one I'll use. I haven't always been a germaphobe, but spending 2 months in the hospital when I was 16 left me a bit obsessive-compulsive when it comes to hygiene. Now, I bring this up because this is an element that is introduced, and Hoover never follows through with it again. Exposition is oftentimes inevitable with opening chapters, so you've got to make sure that you use it effectively. If you waste the reader's time with side stories, if you keep bringing up some elaborate history of an alien culture or something, but you never really bring characterization into it, it can make reading your book a slog, especially if it never comes back up. Or in this case, if you introduce an element that is never mentioned again throughout the rest of the book or never manifests in any real way, then moments like this mean you are wasting the reader's time. And that is not the only time Hoover wastes your time like this. There's another example I'll get to in the next chapter where she does the exact same thing, and that one's more disappointing because it could have been really clever. But then we're finally introduced to the flaws that Fallon was discussing. And those flaws are all the scars that are left as a result of the fire. I bring my left hand up and touch the scars that run across the left side of my face, over my jaw and down my neck. They disappear beneath the collar of my shirt, but underneath my clothing, the scars run down the entire left side of my torso, stopping just below my waistline. I run my fingers over the areas of skin that now resemble puckered leather. Scars that constantly remind me that the fire was real and not just a nightmare I can force myself awake from with a pinch on the arm. Now, that's fine. That is establishing a bit of information about your character and trying to do it in a way that makes sense. A little cliche, perhaps. She's standing in front of a mirror and observing things that way. whatever. As far as delivering the image, it does work. But between 3 paragraphs, we're given 2 conflicting images about how Fallon actually sees these scars. I was bandaged up for months after the fire, unable to touch most of my body. Now that the burns are healed and I'm left with the scars, I catch myself touching them obsessively. The scars feel like stretched velvet, and it would be normal to be revolted by their feel as I am by their appearance. But instead, I actually like the way they feel. I am always absent-mindedly running my fingers up and down my neck or arm, reading the braille on my skin, until I realize what I'm doing and stop. I shouldn't like any aspect of the one thing that ripped my life out from under me, even if it is simply the way that it feels beneath my fingertips. The way it looks is something else. Like each of my flaws has been blanketed in pink highlights, put on display for the entire world to see. No matter how hard I try to hide them with my hair and clothes, they're there. They'll always be there. A permanent reminder of the night that destroyed all the best parts of me. So I'm not sure how to really take the flaws that have been blanketed in pink highlights. Like, this indicates that the scars themselves are not themselves a flaw, and that somehow Fallon has like a deeper type of flaw, like vanity or greed or jealousy or whatever, as like now has visual representation as a burn scar or something. But she never actually comments on this later on throughout the rest of the book, and she doesn't really seem aware of what her actual flaws are, that being a doormat, but we'll get to that in a little bit. But at the same time, she also seems embarrassed or ashamed of the scars, because she does what she can to try to hide them. You know, she moves her hair in front of the scars, wears a lot of non-revealing clothing to try to cover it up. Understandable. That's actually a pretty normal reaction for something like that. But then she also can't help touching them. She seems to hate the scars because they are a permanent reminder of the night that destroyed all the best parts of her. And when she talks about that, I'm assuming she's talking about not just her acting career, because she was fired as a result of them, but also her confidence. And her self-confidence is something that is very evidently affected by the fire. And yet, despite the cover-ups, despite the apparent dislike of what the fire did to her, she enjoys touching the scars. I'm not saying that that's impossible. I'm just saying you're sending a conflicted image, and I don't understand why this character is like this. This was a very traumatic experience, the fire, that left a permanent mark on her life for the rest of her life. She will never be unscarred as a result of this. So why don't we get a clear image about how she really feels about this? If she's like running her hand along her arm, checking the scars that way as kind of a like pinch herself sort of a thing, just to verify that it's real, that it's actually there, then that would be one thing. But she says she likes feeling the scars. So what is going on? And she also reveals that this happened on November 9th. So this is the 2-year anniversary of the night of the fire that apparently her father was at fault for. It seems that he somehow caused the fire and got out of the house, completely forgetting that Fallon was visiting for the weekend. And as a result, she didn't get out on time and was left horribly scarred. And he apologized for several weeks, and eventually that tapered off.
Daddy issues, yeah!
So Fallon hears someone else in the bathroom and decides that it's time to leave, and this gives us another conflicting image about how she feels about the scars, and it comments on her self-confidence in general. I hear a toilet flush, so I turn quickly and make my way to the door before the woman can exit the stall. I do what I can to avoid people most of the time, and not because I'm afraid they'll stare at my scars. I avoid them because they don't stare. The second people notice me, they always look away just as fast because they're afraid to appear rude or judgmental. Just once it would be nice if someone looked me in the eyes and held my stare. It's been so long since that's happened. I hate to admit that I miss the attention I used to get, but I do. And okay, that sends a clear image. She does have some degree of shame about her scars, to a limited point, I guess. And this is part of the reason why she covers up as much as she does. That makes sense. That is reasonable in her circumstance. But then Fallon walks out of the bathroom back towards the booth where her father is waiting for her, and she notices a Studley boy in the adjacent booth. I don't usually notice people, considering they do everything in their power to avoid eye contact with me. However, this guy's eyes are intense, curious, and staring straight at me. So she doesn't notice people, but she notices people not noticing her. This book did not get smoothed out in editing, and it shows. So Fallon and the Studley boy make eye contact, and she makes a few observations about him, how he does not look like the sort of professional that people in this town try to come off as. He looks like he just got out of bed, his hair is a mess, he hasn't shaved. Such an unkempt appearance should be a turnoff, but that's what I find so odd. Despite him looking like he doesn't have one iota of self-absorption, he's one of the most attractive guys I've ever seen.
Dirty boy, dirty, dirty, dirty!
So Fallon sits back down with her father, and he finally asks, what did you want to meet to talk about? What makes you think I want to talk to you about something in particular? He gestures over the table. We're having lunch together. You obviously need to tell me something. It's sad that this is what our relationship has come to. Knowing that a simple lunch date has to be more than just a daughter wanting to see her father. I'm moving to New York tomorrow. Well, tonight actually. But my flight isn't until late, and I don't officially land in New York until the 10th. And I bring this up because this is very indicative of the type of character that the father, Donovan, has. We're not sure exactly how long these two have been having lunch together, but the fact that we are on page 11 and we've had as much conversation and whatnot up to this point suggests that Donovan is very egocentric. He's very self-absorbed. Rather than try to see how Fallon is doing or check up on her in any meaningful regard, he apparently opened up by discussing how he just knocked up his girlfriend. Then talked about himself a lot, and after this he starts talking about himself a lot and starts criticizing a lot of what Fallon's choices are. We'll get to that in a little bit. So he is an entirely selfish, self-centered person. Keep this in mind. We will be coming back to it. So Fallon reveals that she wants to go to New York because when she was 7, her father took her to see Cats on Broadway, and she thinks that she wants to audition for Broadway, maybe give herself a change of pace, which means that I finally get to use this reference.
And nothing of value was lost.
Now, this is something of a Hail Mary attempt on Fallon's part, and she acknowledges this because she does still want to act, despite what the fire did to her, and she has been trying to get along with reading audiobooks in the meantime, something that her father looks down upon, calls it the cesspool of acting, completely ignoring that mimes are a thing. Also, you listen to anything that Stephen Pacey, Sarah Jackson, or Robert Petkoff have read, and you tell me that audiobooks are the cesspool of acting. So after this expositional diatribe, Ben finally makes his appearance and enters in rather directly. He slips in from the adjacent booth, and the same smile he shot at me earlier is still affixed to his face, but this time I don't look away from him. In fact, my eyes don't leave his as he makes his way to our booth. Before I can react, he's sliding into the seat with me. Holy shit, what is he doing? Sorry I'm late, babe, he says, wrapping his arm around my shoulders. He just called me babe. This random dude just put his arm around me and called me babe. What the hell is going on? He blames LA traffic for being late and introduces himself to Fallon's father by saying his name is Benton James Kessler, your daughter's boyfriend. Who uses their middle name when introducing themselves like that? Yes, I'm Benton James Bartholomew Kessler III, Esquire the Fourth. I don't know, it's a weird touch. He whispers to Fallon, just go with it, and she figures out that he's faking all this because he must have overheard the conversation and wants to stick it to Fallon's father. And Donovan doesn't like Ben, especially because Ben is going out of his way to be as obnoxious as possible. Donovan O'Neill, my father says. You probably heard the name before. I was the star of... Nope, Ben interrupts. Doesn't ring a bell. He turns to me and winks. But Fallon here has told me a lot about you. He pinches my arm and looks back at my father. And speaking of our girl, what do you think of her moving all the way to New York? He looks back at me and frowns. I don't want my ladybug running off to another city, but if it means she's following her dream, I'll be the first to make sure she's on her flight. And Ladybug is enough of an odd nickname on its own, except Fallon feels the need to point out, Ladybug, He better be glad he's my fake boyfriend because I feel like punching him in his fake nuts for that cheesy moniker. His nuts are fake?
Cockshot! Oh, your poor wife.
Now, Donovan does not really encourage this decision to move to New York because he thinks that Fallon should be realistic about her options. Because of all of the burns, she's not going to get a lot of roles. So it's a pretty significant hindrance that she has to put up with, as he more or less states it. And you can argue that he's trying to go for the tough love approach, but then he just keeps pushing it and he eventually says this. Listen, Ben, he says his name with a mouthful of distaste. Fallon doesn't need you filling her head with nonsense simply because you're excited about the prospect of having a booty call on the East Coast. So this isn't Donovan putting his foot in his mouth, this is Donovan nomming on his leg all the way up to the hip. And Ben starts arguing with Donovan, and they go back and forth about how Donovan needs to be, more supportive and not such a terrible father. Eventually, Donovan loses the argument and decides to just leave, but not before getting in one last snipe. I may be honest to a fault, but if bullshit is what you prefer to hear, then this prick is perfect for you. He slides out of the booth. I bet your mother loves him, he mutters. And then Donovan leaves, and Fallon has to leave for the bathroom again, probably to recompose herself. Understandable. That was horrible. And then we get a new chapter, and it switches to Ben's point of view. Now, I like that the chapters alternate between Ben and Fallon's point of view because it allows for a more rounded story between the two of their perspectives, and it's also a good way for the audience to have information withheld from the audience, so that it can be revealed later in a juicier manner. Again, on a technical level, this is a good thing for an author to do, or it can be for the appropriate story. But take all of the introductory information that we're getting here and remember it for later because we will be revisiting some of it. Anyway, as Fallon is in the bathroom, Ben considers that he should never have gotten involved the way that he did, and he should probably leave and stop bothering Fallon. In fact, she seems confused that he's even still around when she comes back from the bathroom. And the two of them start just sitting in silence. There's no introduction, no start of a conversation. They're just eating food and sitting quietly. And this allows Ben to start thinking about certain things. And this kind of gets into a writing shtick about Ben that I'm not crazy about, but I can't say that I entirely hate it. So on Reddit, you've got Men Writing Women, which is a collection of terrible writing choices where men will write female characters in very unrealistic ways. But plenty of the critiques are legit. And this feels like the inverse. This feels like women writing men, because Ben will oftentimes fall victim to the myth that guys think about sex every 30 seconds, which is made quite evident in sections like this. I know she isn't shy. I could tell by the way she spoke to her father that she has sass, so I'm a little confused by her silence right now. I swallow my bite of food and take a drink of my soda, maintaining silent eye contact with her the whole time. I wish I could say I'm mentally preparing a brilliant apology, but I'm not. I seem to have a one-track mind, and that track leads straight to the two things I shouldn't even be thinking about right now. Her boobs. Both of them. I know, I'm pathetic, but if we're going to just sit here and stare at each other, it'd be nice if she were showing a little cleavage, instead of wearing this long-sleeve shirt that leaves everything to the imagination. It's pushing 80 degrees outside. She should be in something a lot less convent-inspired.
Yep, I noticed that the word percussion I use in my routines is missing.
Awooga! I've got a bad case of clussy fever, and I want to make whoopee with her cushions.
Now, to a point, this is accurate. Guys at Ben's age, he's 18, will oftentimes think about sex a lot. Not every 30 seconds, that's ridiculous. But that is, early on, one of the most distinguishable things about Ben, and we're about to get into a ramble from him that really solidifies that point. So, you know the comedic archetype about the horn dog who's always talking about sex or trying to get sex, or makes a lot of perverse jokes and things like that. Well, Ben is that character, but played straight and without the comedy aspect, so he immediately falls flat upon inspection. So after maybe a few minutes of awkward silence between the two of them, Fallon finally asks the question, "Where did you go this morning?" in reference to Ben's messy appearance. And she has a Sherlock Holmes-style breakdown about his appearance to try to sum up something about him. "Your burger has mayonnaise on it, and since mustard is hardly ever eaten for breakfast and you're inhaling your food like you haven't eaten since yesterday, then the stain is more than likely from whatever you ate for dinner last night. And you obviously haven't looked in the mirror today or you wouldn't have walked out of your house with your hair looking like that. Did you take a shower and fall asleep without drying your hair?" She touches her long hair and flicks it between her fingers. "Because hair as thick as yours bends when you sleep on it wet. Makes it impossible to fix without rewashing it." She leans towards and eyes me curiously. "How in the heck did the front of your hair get so jacked up? Do you sleep on your stomach or something?" This calls back to the show that Fallon used to work on before the fire. It was called Gumshoe. It was a teenage-centric detective story. And at first, I thought this was a very clever aspect of Fallon's character. She picked up a lot of observation and deduction skills from working on the show and uses that to analyze people. Let's just ignore that her logic in the moment is very faulty. There are plenty of people who eat mustard for breakfast, for example, and some people will step out of the house with their hair looking that bad. But an attempt was made. There are actually two problems with this particular scene. The first one being, we never see this skill set ever again. We have a good, notable use of it early on to help identify character, and it never appears again throughout the rest of the story. Probably because if she does utilize these skills, it'll become too obvious that something is up with Ben and he's hiding some sort of a dark secret. The other problem with it has to do with the order of conversation, because remember, they've been sitting in silence for a while, and then Fallon asks a very pointed question, "Where did you go this morning?" Now, Ben reveals that, yes, he did sleep on his stomach and he was late for class and everything else was otherwise correct about her observations. But rather than try to ease into conversation with any number of questions, we get a very pointed, direct scene where Fallon is using this deduction skill. Now, my assumption about this scene is Hoover wanted to include it as part of Fallon's character for later in the book, but for one reason or another, forgot to include it. That is the only reason I can think of why you would have a scene like this and never use it later in the book. It's too good of a writing tick in order for this all to be an accident. This scene was written intentionally for the moment. This suggests to me that Hoover is going through her books so quickly that she doesn't actually plan everything out very well, even though the elements are there. This could have been such a great moment, such a great aspect of Fallon's character. Absolute waste of time. So the conversation continues after a minute, and Fallon asks Ben what kind of classes he's taking, and he says creative writing. She also asks why did he come to her rescue with the fake boyfriend thing, and he gives this line, "I didn't think you needed rescuing. I just sometimes find it difficult to control my indignation in the presence of absurdity." To which she calls him out and says, "You're definitely a writer, because who the hell talks like that?" Now, in my own observations, there are degrees of writers, like you can tell where someone is on their writing development by the way that they use certain words. And when you get to that flowery, overly detailed mesh of words, you can tell that the person is a little bit beyond than your basic writing level, but we're talking like step 2 out of 10. In regards to Ben's writing, he's like on the front curve of the Dunning-Kruger chart. So they keep talking, share some laughs, and what comes across as really dry humor. And Fallon suggests they go to Pinkberry so they can break up properly. "I hate ice cream. I hate yogurt. I especially hate yogurt pretending to be ice cream." Ben is a terrible character, and I cannot relate to him in any way. So the conversation at the Pinkberry centers a lot around Ben's writing about like how he practically lives at Starbucks, and his passion is novels and a little bit of poetry. And Fallon gives him the creative nickname Ben, the writer. And because she's kind of in transition, Ben calls her Fallon the Transient. And Fallon does think that Ben's being nice, but she thinks it's an act. Her self-confidence is so shot that the idea of a guy actually flirting with her seems impossible. So she kind of starts snapping at Ben and doesn't like a lot of the responses that he starts giving her because she doesn't think that he's being genuine. And so to convince Fallon that Ben actually does find her attractive and he's not just putting on a front, he goes on a speech that's supposed to be really endearing and really sweet, and I don't think it comes across that way. I ignore her cynicism and continue. The first time you walked past me, before I interrupted your lunch date with your father, I stared at your ass the whole time you were stomping away, and I couldn't help but wonder what kind of panties you had on. That's all I thought about the entire time you were in the restroom. Were you a thong girl? Were you going commando? Because I didn't see an outline in your jeans that hinted you were wearing normal panties. Before you returned from the bathroom, I started to get this panicked feeling in my stomach because I wasn't sure if I wanted to see your face. I had been listening in on your conversation and already knew I was drawn to your personality. But what about your face? People say not to judge a book by its cover, but what if you somehow read the inside of a book without seeing the cover first? And what if you really liked what was inside that book? Of course, when you go to close the book and you are about to see the cover for the first time, you hope it's something you'll find attractive. Because who wants an incredibly written book sitting on their bookshelf if they have to stare at a shitty cover? The red flags here are flashing so much you'd mistake it for the lights on a fire engine. So not only does Ben go on a lengthy, objectifying ramble about what kind of panties Fallon might have on, he also, unironically, argues a defense for judging a book by its cover. This man is supposed to be a writer, and he went and he actually tried to argue why you should judge a book by its cover. I'm actually at a loss for that. Especially because it's such a stupid argument to begin with, because there's so much value you could actually get from the book as a total. So, I collect books, as I'm sure you've noticed. One of my collections downstairs is actually my vintage collection, and I collect all sorts of different books from all sorts of different eras. I even have books from the 1800s that I want to touch as little as possible. I hope you understand why I don't actually have one up here on display. But one that I did bring up is The Detective by Roderick Thorpe. Now, this was published in 1966, and doesn't have a great cover. It's rather plain here. It's actually torn in the back. But this is the book that inspired the movie The Detective with Frank Sinatra, and was the book that came first in the series to Nothing Lasts Forever, which is the book that inspired Die Hard. I love having books like this in my collection. I love the worn cover. I love the aged pages, especially because this book is very difficult to find in a physical copy. Amazon, for example, only has it on Kindle. I would hesitate to call Ben a real writer, because if he doesn't have an appreciation for books like this, and actually argues that you should judge a book by its cover, what kind of breadth of experience, what shallow nonsense is this guy actually peddling? Especially considering that we do get to see samples of his writing later in the book. It's not good. Ben is an anti-writer. You can't convince me otherwise. He has a lot of stereotypes about writing and doesn't actually live up to the mantle of actual writer, which really makes me question, what was Hoover going for? If this is the perspective that her characters view, and Ben is supposed to be an aspiring writer, how does she view that? What is her perspective in all of that? I'm not saying she advocates for Ben's terrible perspectives, but it does make you wonder. But that's not even the worst part. Ben could tell that Fallon was insecure because of the way that she would, when they locked eyes, and the way that she tried to recoil a little bit and She actually covered her face with her hair while she was passing. And he says this: "I was so relieved," I tell her, "because I could tell with that one simple movement that you were really insecure. And I realized, since you obviously had no idea how fucking beautiful you were, that I just might actually have a chance with you. And so I smiled, because I was hoping if I played my cards right, I might get to find out exactly what kind of panties you were wearing under those jeans." This is supposed to be a romance. Okay, because there's nothing the ladies like more than a creepy weirdo. Yay! Ben speaks like some sort of a crazed incel loner who speaks in hollow platitudes, but rather than get like rejected and mocked the way that we would expect him, he gets results, because this line works. She inhales a deep breath and then releases it just as her eyes fall back to mine. "I still have a lot of stuff to pack tonight," she says. "Offering to help is the polite thing for a boyfriend to do, you know." How did that work? How did that work?
Okay, I know it's filthy rich coming from me, but your powers are bullshit.
Ben said, "You look insecure, I bet I can get you out of your pants." And her response was, "Hey big boy, let's go back to my place," when she should have pulled out pepper spray. This was written by a woman. Reminder, we haven't gotten to the bad part yet. I think another thing that's really distressing about the book at this moment is there's an element of fantasy that could have existed that we could play with. 365 Days, for all of its faults, you can at least excuse to a point, because it's such a ridiculous concept of a mafioso randomly abducting a woman and trying to turn her into his wife, that, I mean, you could see a fantasy element of it. There's a lack of realism just in the premise alone, so you don't read it as real. November 9 doesn't get that advantage because everything is so realistic and down to earth, which is normally a great thing, except when you're dealing with particular elements that would otherwise be better for a fantasy, like Ben's creepy weirdo behavior. Then it feels like you're trying to take a realistic approach to everything that he's doing. So by giving him this realistic approach, by making him feel, by making it look like this is supposed to be how a real person would behave, and then rewarding that behavior later on, as the book does, you seem to be acknowledging, if not rewarding, that sort of pattern of behavior. And that is really not something that guys should be emulating at all. Ben is the opposite of how guys should act. So we get another POV shift and we go back to Fallon, and she says that her mother is her hero, her role model, the woman she aspires to be.
You are my muse and my flame.
And Fallon gives a lot of backstory about her mother that we don't really need to go over for this review, but I will point out that Fallon's mother filed for divorce when she was 23. "My mother isn't famous. She doesn't have an incredible career. She isn't even married to the love of her life. But there's one thing she's always been. Right." Does that include when she married a jerkwad? 23 is actually a significant age because Fallon is convinced that that's when she's done growing up, because that's when her mother left her father. And so at that point, she'll be ready to actually fall in love, and this will be important for later. So Ben and Fallon make their way back to Fallon's apartment so they can finish packing, and Ben meets Fallon's roommate, Amber, and her boyfriend, Glenn. Ben instantly turns on the charm. Ben gives them a quick wave and then removes his arm from around my shoulders, sliding his fingers through mine. "Nice to meet you both," he points down the hall. "I'm going to follow Fallon to her room now so I can see what kind of panties she has on." You know, a better written book, that actually might have been funny, but this is so new to the relationship, and Ben just met Amber and Glenn, so this comes off as really off-putting as opposed to comic. Inside Fallon's room, she has all of her books still stacked up on her bookshelf. Yes, both of these characters are involved in reading and writing. Fallon tries to be supportive and says that Ben should hurry up and write a book because it's already on her TBR pile. And Ben doesn't know what a TBR pile is. Now, it's fine to try to point this out and spell out what a to-be-read pile is for readers who may not be acquainted with that particular concept, but Ben is a writer. Ben probably should know what this is, because the only other explanation I can think of is that he skipped all the important reading bits and went straight to writing, which is oftentimes a mistake. You don't have a full appreciation or understanding for the written word if you just jump straight into writing. Case in point, Onion Boy. A lot of the books on Fallon's shelves are romance novels, which Ben isn't really crazy about. He wouldn't write a romance because he's not an expert when it comes to things in love. He's too young and he hasn't really had that kind of experience. Fallon points out that that's why it's called fiction. You just make stuff up, which does seem to be a running theme for this entire book and Hoover's entire career. Fallon then hopes that Ben would start rolling around in her sheets so she can smell him in her sheets, and Ben picks up on this and gives a really bad pickup line. He laughs quietly. "You were just thinking dirty thoughts." "Was not," I quip. "Fallon, we've been dating for 2 hours now. I can read you like a book. And right now, I do believe that book is full of erotica." That sounds like a line thought up by Zap Brannigan.
I find the most erotic part of a woman is the boobies.
Kev!
Oh my.
Now, keep in mind these two are effectively strangers. They've known each other for a total of maybe 2 hours. Despite that, Ben somehow thinks it's appropriate for him to wander over to Fallon's panty drawer and... "Is that your panty drawer?" He reaches around and grabs a pair. I pull them out of his hand and toss them toward my suitcase. "Hands off," I tell him. He walks around me and leans his elbow against the dresser. "If you're packing underwear, that means you don't go commando. So, by process of elimination, I figured out that you're currently wearing a thong. Now I just have to find out what color it is." Oh my god, fucking stop it. Is there anyone out there who actually finds this charming? Like, even among Hoover's fans, is this an attractive quality to them?
Blood Ultra.
Get away from there, Minetta, you perv!
Even though he promised to help her pack, Ben actually pokes around Fallon's room and makes reservations for dinner at a place called Chateau Marmont. Now, this isn't like going down to a Chipotle or something, so Fallon instantly worries about what the hell is she going to wear to a chateau, because she's packing, she's leaving that night. It's not like she can just go wear whatever, especially since her flight's at 10 and the reservations are for 7. That is cutting it very close. But Ben has a suggestion. He goes into her closet and starts going around judging some of the dresses, and finally sets on one that he rather likes. And this is another moment that made me unconsciously think that this was supposed to be a thriller, not a romance. I shake my head and grab the dress from him, hanging it back in its spot. I grab one of the few long-sleeve dresses I own and pull it off the hanger. "I like this one." His eyes fall to the dress he initially picked out and pulls it off the hanger and shoves it at me. "But I want you to wear this one." I shove the dress back at him. "I don't want to wear that. I want to wear this." "No," he says. "I'm paying for dinner, so I get to choose what to stare at while we eat."
Women.
And then Fallon reveals, in a heartfelt manner, that she doesn't like the particular dress that Ben is pulling because it was from her mother's "Let's Fix Fallon" stage, when her mother was trying to get her more comfortable in her skin. You know, show something a little more revealing because "you're still beautiful, darling, don't worry about it." But it doesn't really work because it shows off too much skin, and Fallon feels very exposed as a result. Ben hears this explanation and then chooses not to respect it. Ben's jaw tenses and he looks away from me, down at the dress in his hands. "Okay," he says simply, dropping the dress to the floor. "Finally. But it's your own fault people feel uncomfortable looking at you." And Ben starts listing a few behaviors that he's noticed out of Fallon and starts criticizing her because of it, which leads to this. "People don't feel uncomfortable when they look at you because of your scars, Fallon. They're uncomfortable because you make people feel like looking at you is wrong. And believe me, you're the type of person people want to stare at." I feel his fingertips graze my jaw and I flinch. "You have the most incredible bone structure. And I know that's a weird compliment, but it's true." His fingers leave my jaw and trail up my chin until he's touching my mouth. "And your lips. Men stare at them because they want to know what they taste like, and women stare at them out of jealousy because if they had lips the color of yours, they'd never have to buy lipstick again. I don't want to use a buzzword accusation and say that Ben is blaming the victim here, since there is some possible validity to the idea that he's actually putting on here about people feeling uncomfortable looking at Fallon. Certain habits that are developed without thought can manifest in ways that make people repellent to others. Spitting chewing tobacco is gross to a lot of people, but totally normal or even done without conscious thought for plenty of others. However, Ben is revealing all of this in a way that sounds like it's coming from a lifelong friend. Ben also tries to justify his stupid line by claiming that Fallon makes people uncomfortable by making them feel like staring at her is wrong. Interesting headcanon he's constructed for himself. Keep in mind that he's only known Fallon for 2 hours, has had minimal interaction with her, and acts like he's figured her out completely. Ben is the sort of person who takes one college-level class and acts like he's discovered the secrets of the universe.
I'm getting real tired of your first-year psych student bullshit.
And somehow, despite all of this nonsense, and despite the fact that this has gotten Fallon to expose something personal and she's crying as a result, Ben starts taking her clothes off. Now, this scene is presented with a bit of a wink and a nod. Some sexual flirtation here as he removes her pants and her shirt just to put the dress on her. And there's a section here where, like, she's actively crying, like a tear falls down her cheek, and he just presses on as if ignoring that, and that provides very uncomfortable subtext for the scene as Ben is actively taking her clothes off. And of course he tries to round this out with a joke by, as soon as the dress is on her, he says, your panties, they're red. Now this is one of those moments where I feel like the only reason fans of this book would go along with the sexual tension is because they're reading it kind of on a meta level where they understand this is supposed to be sexy, and so they convince themselves that this is sexy. When you have to completely divorce yourself from what's going on subtextually and in context in the moment, where you've got Fallon very uncomfortable, Ben not even acknowledging that she's uncomfortable and just pressing forward anywhere, and then immediately going on about the color of her underwear, as if that's somehow funny. This is so devoid of human emotion. It's so weird. Like, this is an incel fantasy at this point. This is a guy who's had no luck with women and has somehow lucked into a woman who doesn't refuse him, ever, or at least so far, and she doesn't break down at this point. She agrees to go out to dinner if he goes home, shaves, and showers. And, okay, such a great demand. And he says he'll be back at 6 to pick her up. And as he's leaving, he passes Amber and Glenn and loudly announces that Fallon's underwear is red.
And the local girls thought you were quite the charmer.
Ben's next chapter opens up to him thinking that he really shouldn't be doing this. Referring to interacting with Fallon at all. Also small enough, but we see Ben changing into a pair of jeans and a clean shirt, which doesn't sound appropriate for a place called Chateau Mormont, especially if Fallon is wearing a dress. Suit up, bitch! And also Ben talks to his roommate and older brother, Kyle. Kyle makes note that he knows where Ben was the previous night. Mysterious. And also, Kyle's girlfriend is worried about Ben. Everyone is. And we're not left with a lot of time to really wonder what that is, but the seed has been planted. Ben was up to something last night, and now we get to have that question lingering in the back of our minds as we read this. And again, that's a good element. We have these small mysteries that get planted periodically throughout the book that stand out, that don't become too complicated, that don't get buried among other questions that we're supposed to ask. And Hoover is very carefully spread them out. So she does utilize this element very well. Now, if only she could have fixed her characters. So Ben arrives at Fallon's place a little early. He said 6. He's there at 5:05, which is actually a terrible move. He says that, the extra 55 minutes isn't nearly as much time as he wants to spend with Fallon. Okay, except now you're rushing her. She's barely finished showering by the time he gets over there. And so she hands him a romance novel. We're not given a title. And he starts going through it. Page 17, page 20, page 37. Jesus, this is like crack.
Peanut butter and crack.
Fallon finishes getting ready and she steps out in her dress. Ben says she looks beautiful. And Fallon says she feels stupid. But Ben is there, ready to give her a compliment and make her feel better. I barely know you, so I'm not about to argue with you over your level of intelligence, because you could very well be as dumb as a rock, but at least you're pretty.
Shut up. You're like part of the problem now or something.
Backhanded compliments aside, Ben is so drawn to Fallon in this moment that he really wants to kiss her, and it's taking all of his power not to do that quite yet. Although his explanation of that is perplexing. She pulls her neck back and her eyebrows draw together in confusion. Do you always feel like you're about to puke when you feel like kissing a girl? I shake my head. Not until you. She huffs and pushes past me. That did not come out how I meant it. I didn't mean the thought of kissing you makes me sick. I mean, I want to kiss you so bad it's making my stomach hurt. Kind of like blue balls, but in my stomach instead of my balls.
You make my balls so blue, they're hanging sadly.
Again, r/women writing men. Ben tries pushing the idea of a relationship and thinks about, maybe they should exchange numbers or email addresses or something. But because Fallon has promised her mother that she wouldn't fall in love with anyone until she was 23, she refuses all of that. Ben takes this in stride and asks her to look him up when she's 23. And they lay down on the bed together, kind of cuddling, kind of just staring at each other. And Ben starts gently brushing the scars on her forearm and gives a line that doesn't come off well. I'm sure you're surprised by this point that Ben has bad dialogue. I should hate this for you, I whisper, trailing my fingers over the scars on her forearm. I should be angry for you, because going through this must have been excruciatingly painful. But for whatever reason, whenever I touch you, I like the way your skin feels. Just look at that paragraph and tell me I'm not supposed to read the last line as Igor. And the chapter closes as Fallon gives some tawdry comment about how everyone has scars, hers are just visible and most people's aren't. And Ben has a bit of self-hatred, perhaps, because I don't tell her she's right. I don't tell her that she's as beautiful as she looks on the outside. I only wish I could look like that on the inside. Gee, I wonder what he did. Fallon then wakes up to Ben swearing because they missed their reservation by quite a lot, and also they spent about 2 hours sleeping. Unfortunately, they're not going to be able to make it to the restaurant or dinner at all. They actually have to get going for the airport. But before they do that, they finally share their first kiss. And it keeps going and keeps going, and they go back into Fallon's room, and there's more sexual tension, but it gets derailed when Fallon starts thinking this. I'm dizzy. I'm so dizzy it feels good. My mother is crazy, stupid, insane, absurd, and she's wrong. Why would a girl care to find herself when she'll never be able to make herself feel as good as a guy can? Okay, now I'm just being stupid, but Ben is making me feel really good things right now. He groans and I freaking lose it. My hands are in his hair, and his mouth is all over my neck. Grab my boob, Ben. He totally reads my mind and grabs my boob. Grab the other one. God, he's so telepathic. It's just the grab my boob bit. Just... Oh, man.
I'm coming, Zalmo. Quick, grab my balls.
Before they can go much further, Amber interrupts them. Classic romantic comedy scene breaking whatever thing. I guess Hoover's not opposed to cliches, but because Ben lives near the airport, he offers to drive Fallon to the airport. It's just a reason for them to spend more time together. While they're on the way over there, Fallon rates their kiss as a 7 out of 10, and then they start discussing, what makes something a real book-worthy kiss. Ben also asks when Fallon's first audition is, and she's kind of afraid to audition. When's her first audition? He sure does have a lot of faith in me. I haven't looked into it yet. Honestly, I'm kind of terrified to audition. I'm scared people will take one look at me and laugh. What's wrong with that? With being laughed at? I ask. For one, it's humiliating, and it's a confidence killer. He looks at me pointedly. I hope they laugh at you, Fallon. If people are laughing at you, it means you're putting yourself out there to be laughed at. Not enough people have the courage to even take that step. So it's obvious that Ben is really inexperienced when it comes to wording things, and I take it that that's just an intentional part of his character, budding author, and all authors are usually pretty bad with words when they first start out. It's part of the process, whatever. But Ben is like really bad with words. I think what he's going for is, I hope you find the courage to put yourself out there, and he should just say, like, you know, forget all those other people, they don't matter, or something. But instead it's like, I hope they laugh at you. I hope you fall down and people mock you for years. I hope your audition is so bad you become the face of a meme. But Fallon suggests that Ben should really write a romantic comedy because he's kind of funny. So Fallon will go to auditions, Ben will write a book. They both have goals, but how do they make sure that they're actually accountable for one another? Because it's not like they're ever going to see each other again, and Fallon still doesn't want to exchange phone numbers. So Ben suggests, what if they meet up again next year on the same day, and the year after that? We'll do it for 5 years, same date, same time, same place. That way they can exchange stories, make sure that Ben is still writing that book, and Fallon is going to auditions and the like. Fallon even suggests that this sounds like a really good basis for a romance novel. It's not. And I only say that because I recently watched Same Time Next Year. It's not a good movie. It starts out as a comedy and it evolves into some tawdry drama about two people who are knowingly having an affair for 26 years. And they never face repercussions because of it, while they are both actively cheating on their spouses. But meeting up once a year is not enough. They both have to give each other homework. Ben's homework is he has to read 5 of Fallon's favorite romance novels in order to get him started on how to write a romance. And she wants the character that Ben bases on her to be funnier and have bigger boobs and less flab. She also writes down the name of the restaurant they met at and today's date so that he doesn't forget. Then Ben has a number of homework assignments for her. First off, people have to laugh at her at least once a week. She also has to go on 5 dates by the time they see each other again. And she has to kiss 2 guys. And just to make sure that they don't ruin the plan, they block each other on social media. They don't exchange phone numbers or email or anything like that. They will have 0 contact between one another. You'll understand why this is a logistical nightmare shortly. And then Ben just drops Fallon off at the curb at the airport. No real celebratory goodbyes or anything, just have a safe flight, see you next year. Then Fallon heads inside and starts thinking about what she's going to do when she gets to New York, when all of a sudden, this happens. Fallon! My eyes flick open. I turn around and Ben is standing at the revolving door. He begins running toward me in slow motion. I cover my mouth with my hand and try not to laugh as he slowly stretches out an arm like he's reaching out for me. He's yelling, "Don't go yet!" as he moves slowly through the crowd of people. This is something he hinted at earlier in the car, but it's just so cringy. Like, I didn't want to give you guys any kind of a heads up that he was going to do this, because while it was telegraphed earlier, think about how everyone else around must feel about this, how excruciating this display would have to be.
Cringe. There's no other word for it. This makes me cringe. It's embarrassing.
And then they share a kiss. Ben one more time says, "I hope the entire state of New York laughs at you." And Fallon decides that that kiss really was a 10 out of 10. And that is the first November 9th they spent together. Second November 9th. Her tears and my soul, they live parallel lives. Run, ache, burn, repeat. Her tears and my soul, they live parallel lives.
What is that supposed to mean?
So it's the next year. Ben has actually finished all of the books that Fallon suggested he read, and he read like another 21 on top of that. Now, because these two are stupid, they don't actually have a way to communicate with one another in case anything goes wrong on this very Hail Mary pass of a way to hang out. Ben's waiting in the restaurant at the appointed time, but Fallon's not around. what's going on? In a very unlikely moment, Ben gets approached by a woman working at the Pinkberry from down the street who has a phone on her and says that some girl's on the phone and it's an emergency. Turns out Fallon's plane was delayed and she's not going to be there on time. Now, granted, that's better than being stood up, but it means they're going to have to change plans. So they agreed to meet at Ben's place since it's close to the airport. Now, Fallon wasn't sure what to expect at Ben's place. She figured it would be an apartment, but it turns out it's a 2-story house, or as she puts it, a house.
That's a good girl.
But she also has to leave later that night since her flight is at 10:30, so the two of them have about 5.5 hours together. And Ben tries acting aloof and tough and alpha, but it doesn't really work, and he almost immediately falls back back into his old traits that Fallon found so funny and charming. We quietly take each other in for a moment. I was starting to forget what he looked like, but now that I'm in front of him, it's like I never even left. He looks less like a teenager now than he did last year. And it makes me wonder if, when I see him again next year, he'll look just like a man. Not that there's any difference between a man and a 19-year-old, because they're the same thing. We get a lot of sentences like that, which just come off as sloppy. It really makes me wonder how much thought did Hoover put into writing this. It's redundant because you're presenting an idea, and then you're repeating that idea. It's like saying, steaks are my favorite food because of the food I like to eat the most. Now, there have been a lot of really basic surface-level book references up to this point. TBR piles, writers practically living in Starbucks, minor things like that. And I bring that up because Fallon tries playing around with the idea of book sting. Ben gives his speech about how she's not going to get alpha-Ben today, he's sorry. So she says this. Ben, I say, narrowing my eyes, are you book sting me? He cocks an eyebrow. Book sting? Yeah, when a hot guy talks books with a girl, it's like sexting, but out loud, and with books instead of sex. Nor does it have to do with texts. Okay, so it's nothing like sexting, but it made sense in my head. And then they start playing around with innuendos, and they talk about hardbacks and how Fallon should see Ben's TBR pile because it's huge. Now, there's some idea of meta-commentary within the book that one might be able to play around with that is interesting to experiment with, but doesn't really work in total in the book itself. On page 84, Ben made a comment about the research he's done, concluding that Fallon is right. Kisses in books and kisses in real life aren't the same. And he does, in fact, agree that what he did at the airport was cringy.
Thank you!
And during a conversation about a lot of tropes that exist in romance novels, Fallon points this out. And if you and I were having sex and you told me you owned me, I would literally crawl out from under you, put on my clothes, walk out of your house, and go puke in your front yard. So just because I like reading about those kinds of guys doesn't mean I need my real life guys to act like that. And that seems to be a comment on a lot of guys in romances about how rough and tumble and how overly masculine a lot of them are, sometimes very forceful. It is a wonder that Anna Todd likes this book. There's commentary directly against her own trash. And this seems to paint the book in a sense of realism. Ben isn't going to be those other guys, putting a spin on that. And Ben's going to be a little more reasonable, perhaps emotional, not as forceful. But all of that is going to be contradicted by the end of the book. So this particular line is not substantiated and is in fact countered by the very book it exists inside of. The other interpretation is that this is some sort of a meta-commentary excuse on why Ben behaves the way that he does throughout the rest of the book. The problem is, this still contradicts all of that, so it makes Hoover sound like a hypocrite. Then Ben pushes Fallon onto her back on the bed and insists that she describe the boy that she kissed, which makes this moment seem like something out of an NTR fetish. Don't look that up, by the way. And Fallon did hang out with this guy for a little while, but apparently he made her feel flawed somehow.
Loser! You're a loser! Are you feeling sorry for yourself? Well, you should be, because you are dirt!
Apparently, part of the reason they broke up is that Fallon didn't want this other guy to see her without any clothes on. Because in her mind, guys think that breasts are supposed to be beautiful and symmetrical, and hers are not.
Great! Start the reactor!
But Ben tries to use this to his advantage and tries to get her to show off the girls. I feel Ben's hand meet my wrist and he pulls my arm from my face. He gently palms my cheek. Why would it bother you for anyone to see it? Because it's scarred? I nod, but then I shake my head. This is so embarrassing, Ben. Not to me, he says. And it sure as hell shouldn't be for you. I've seen you without a shirt already, remember? As I recall, it was pretty magnificent. You've seen me without a shirt, but you should see me without a bra. You would understand. Ben immediately lifts up to his elbow. Okay. I stare at him in disbelief. That wasn't an invitation. But I want to see it! I shake my head. I even laugh, because there's no way in hell I'm just going to plop my boob out of my shirt so we can gawk at its hideousness. I want to do the book justice, and your injuries are something I have to talk about, so you should let me see it. We'll consider it research. I'm amused by the term plop my boob out. But Fallon's a little hesitant to actually go through with this, but Ben puts his foot down and gives the most inspirational speech that he found on r/incel. You listen to me, he says, keeping his hand secured over my mouth so I can't interrupt him. Wow! It pisses me off that you allow something so trivial to define such a huge part of you. I can't make you pretty in this book because that would be an insult. You're fucking beautiful! And you're funny! And the only times I'm not completely enamored by you are the moments you're feeling sorry for yourself. Because I don't know if you've realized this yet, but you're alive, Fallon. And every time you look in the mirror, you don't have the right to hate what you see. Because you survived when a lot of people don't get that lucky. So from now on, when you think about your scars, you aren't allowed to resent them. You're going to embrace them because you're lucky to be on this earth to see them. And any guy you allow to touch your scars better thank you for that privilege. And then she said no, and then he called her a bitch and sent her a dick pic.
Don't act surprised, you know you like it, you whore.
Well, all this talk about boobs has gotten Ben hot and heavy, and so they start making out. And eventually he does get to play around with Fallon, and he does get to see the girls. I will say, credit to Hoover, Ben actually isn't coming off as much of a creep as he's been. He's actually very communicative and checks in on Fallon as he's going along. It does kind of put a damper on the romantic chemistry they're supposed to have at all, but at least it doesn't look like he's trying to take advantage of her, so points for the bare minimum, I guess. But just as Ben is rounding second base, somebody calls to him from the doorway, and this is how we get to meet Jordan, who is the fiance to Kyle, Ben's older brother. See, Jordan had popped into the room because she was looking for a pair of scissors, and Fallon is definitely not a pair of scissors. Fallon is a little high-strung because she and Kyle are getting married soon, and she stresses out to the point of parody, but that's kind of an unfortunate continuity with a lot of these side characters. With the exception of Ben and Fallon, almost all of the characters have singular traits that they don't really escape from. And those are the ones who actually do have enough of a trait to define. Jordan, for example, as I've said, is really high-strung. Amber, who was Fallon's roommate, who will be coming back later in the story, doesn't really have a personality. She's Fallon's roommate. Ugh. And then there's another character who, honestly, you could cut from this entire book and it wouldn't matter that much. Ben has his eldest brother show up, Ian. I follow Ben into the living room to see a man kneeling down by the front door, petting a little white dog. "There's my little bitch," he says sweetly to the dog. As sweet as that sentence can sound, anyway. That's a normal thing that dog owners say. And then Kyle shows up, Ben introduces Fallon, and Then Ben and Kyle go out of the room to have a quick conversation, and all of a sudden, I hear a loud thud come from the hallway. Worried it might be Jordan, I walk in that direction. I immediately pause when I see Ben pressed up against the wall with Kyle's arm against his throat. "Are you an idiot?" Kyle says through clenched teeth. Ben is looking at Kyle like he wants to kill him, but he isn't making an effort to fight back. Just as I'm about to rush down the hallway to pull Kyle off of him, Ben catches sight of me out of the corner of his eye. Kyle then turns to see what caught Ben's attention, and as soon as he sees me, he takes a step back, releasing Ben. And this is another one of those seeded mysteries that will carry through for later. Like, what's going on? What's Ben's backstory on what's going on with all of this? Especially because even after he released him, Kyle swings a quick punch at Ben and clocks him in the eye, apparently hard enough to draw blood. And as he's recounting this to himself, Ben provides a bit of misdirection for the reader. Like, in context, he knows exactly what's going on here, but Hoover needed to blindside the audience for later, so Ben gives a line that doesn't actually make sense once you understand the whole picture. I still can't believe he hit me. In all my life, he's never hit me. He's come very close a time or two. Either he's really stressed about his wedding, or I've really pissed him off this time. Despite the fight, Ben tries to defend his brother, saying, "This is unlike Kyle. He's never done something like this before. He's normally a pretty good brother." And I'd have to disagree with that. So Ben tells a story about this bully who used to bother him on the bus when he was in 4th grade, and how Kyle reacted to that particular moment. And this is all supposed to make Kyle look like a good older brother, and I'd really have to disagree with that. Kyle is a couple years older than me. He was in middle school, but we rode the same bus because we went to a fairly small school. One day, after the kid hit me right in front of Kyle, I expected him to take up for me, to beat the kid's ass, because I'm his little brother. That's what big brothers are supposed to do, protect their little brothers from bullies. I stretched my legs out in front of me and sighed. But Kyle just sat there, staring at me. He never intervened, and when we got home, I was so angry with him. I told him it was his job as my brother to teach the bullies a lesson. He laughed and said, "And how will that teach you anything?" And Ben goes on about how he had to learn how to stand up for himself, or rather, learn how to defend himself by ignoring the bully. That's not really a defense, but okay. And he sums this up by saying he's a good brother, he's a good person. But that doesn't make any sense, especially not considering their ages. The story sounds like Kyle is apathetic, like he doesn't really want to stand up for his little brother. For what would be a pretty good reason. And I say that from direct experience. Now, I am an older brother. I got a little brother. And we used to go to the same, well, it was a secondary school, so middle and high school combined. And back in those days, we used to fight quite a bit. Not like full-on aggression or anything like that, but, standard big brother, little brother stuff. I'd mock him, he'd be obnoxious, and we'd just go back and forth like that. But the moment my brother told me that someone was bullying him, I dropped what I was doing and was like, all right, let's go. And this is not a story about how I, as a high schooler, beat up a middle schooler. I didn't have to throw a punch. All I did was find this kid in the parking lot, like after school, and say, "Oh, you're the one who's been bothering my brother," and then crack my knuckles in his face. It was basically that scene from Megamind.
So, you're the punk I've heard about.
And that was all I had to do. Didn't throw a punch, just shook the kid enough to let him know to back off. And that's all it took. You don't have to get violent in order to defend somebody, but the fact that we're being told one thing and shown something completely different irritates me. I honestly couldn't tell you if Kyle is a decent older brother or not because we never see an example of it. This is another in a long list of examples I can cite where I don't think Hoover understands the image that she painted. This is something that you got to rely on your beta readers for to understand how your story or your scene or your characters come across. Although in this case, I think that she was being exceptionally lazy because she had one idea in mind and never second-guessed herself. Because this was a pretty easy example to see that this is, like, what was shown doesn't mesh up with what was told. I don't know how she missed this. Fallon also gives some updates on her life. Apparently, the woman that her father was dating wasn't actually pregnant. She was faking the whole thing because she wanted to marry him and get his money. They've since broken up. She's tried out for community theater. Apparently tomorrow, is opening day. She doesn't have the lead role, and it doesn't pay anything, but she enjoys it because a lot of the other actors go to her for advice. And then the question of what does Kyle do for a living come up. Do you even have a job? She asks. I can't believe I don't know that about you. I let you fondle my breasts, and I don't even know what you do for a living.
You must be the parents of this young lady. I'm sorry I didn't get her name, but hopefully my son did.
Ben reveals he is a full-time student with a double major in creative writing and communications because you need a backup plan since it takes a while to get a best-selling novel to really pay your bills. And he announces that the title of the book he's writing about the two of them is going to be November 9. Which is a strange coincidence because, as Fallon points out, November 9th is the anniversary of the fire. In the next chapter, Ben takes Fallon to a tattoo parlor because their time together is very limited, so, of course, this can't possibly wait. Ben wants to get a tattoo on his left wrist, I guess on the inside, with the word poetic written inside of a musical staff. Fallon doesn't know what the meaning of it is, and Ben won't tell her. In order to keep himself distracted, Ben asks Fallon to sit in his lap and straddle him while he's getting the tattoo. And she starts asking questions to keep his mind off the tattoo process. And Ben has had plenty of stupid lines, but it's been a while since Fallon has had one, so it's her turn. What's your favorite food? Pad Thai. He says, yours? Sushi. They're almost the same thing. Not even close, he says. They're both Asian food. It's like saying pizza and risotto are the same thing because they're both Italian. Eventually the questions lead to when's your birthday, and this is a bit concerning for Ben because he thinks that it's a turn-off for girls if they're older than the guys dating them. The corner of his mouth twitches as he tries to hold back his smile. July 4th, he says. The whole country celebrates my birthday every year. It's quite epic. July 25th, which means you are officially older than me. I can safely pursue you now and not be considered a cougar. He runs his hand up my waist a couple of inches, and then his thumb moves side to side slowly. You can't pursue the willing, Fallon. Oh, dang. He deserves a kiss for that comment, but there's a guy with a tattoo gun 2 feet away, and I'm not the type of girl who would make out with a guy in public. Apparently, I draw the line at straddling him. Yeah, that's actually kind of weird. Why is she not okay with at least a quick peck on the cheek, but she's okay with straddling him, which is a much more intimate and revealing act. After the tattoo, they drive to the airport and they discuss where they're going to meet up next year, and Fallon suggests they go to Brooklyn because that's where she lives, and she gives him an address to find her at a restaurant. And they share a kiss as he drops her off, and she tries not to cry as she goes into the airport and eventually boards the plane. But as she's settling in as the plane is boarding and she tries to relax because she doesn't like flying, can't blame her, she hears Ben's voice and then opens her eyes and Ben is just standing there. I sit up straight. What are you doing? Someone is trying to squeeze past him, so he moves to where he's standing as close to me as he can get. When the man passes, Ben kneels down. I forgot to give you your homework for this year. He hands me a folded sheet of paper. I had to buy a plane ticket in order to get it to you before you took off, so that means you have to follow through with it or I'm out a lot of money for naught. And who actually says naught? Anyway, that's all. Totally not an alpha move, but whatever. And then he gets off the plane and goes back home. The homework assignment is actually a hastily written note that Ben wrote, and he actually reveals that he had to pay $400 for the ticket, so he must have written this as he was running through the hallways in the airport. Fallon, I lied. Kind of. I don't have a lot of homework for you because I think you're doing a good job at adulting. I mostly wanted to give you this letter because I wanted to thank you for showing up today. I forgot to thank you earlier. It sucks that you have to go a day without sleep, but it means a lot that you sacrificed that sleep to follow through with our assignment. I'll make it up to you next year, I promise. As for this year, there's only one thing I want you to do. Go visit your father. I know, he's an asshole, but he's the only father you have, and when you told me you haven't spoken to him since last year, I couldn't help but feel at fault for that. I feel guilty for the fight you guys got into because my butting in didn't help matters. I should have stayed out of it, but had I stayed out of it, I wouldn't have the privilege of finding out what kind of panties you had on. I'm so glad we managed to squeeze in another reference. And that was the end of the second year. Year 3! She loved me, in quotations. She kissed me, in bold. I tried to keep her, in all caps. She left with an ellipses.
You have no proof and will never be published, except possibly in the Book of Idiots.
These poems are also basic. They're either, like, really clouded messages, or they're so simple that there's only the one interpretation you can make. So, Fallon's sitting in a restaurant that she told Ben to meet her at, and she's going over some plans that she had for the day. Apparently one of them involved visiting some stuff, like the life and death of Dylan Thomas, who happens to be Ben's favorite poet, who died in New York in 1953 on November the 9th. And that just makes me wonder if Hoover wrote this entire book around November 9th for exactly that point. But just like last year, Ben doesn't show up on time, and like a waitress approaches Fallon with a phone saying, hey, you got a phone call. And at first, granted, I thought that this was some sort of a cutesy moment of Ben just playing back the same event that that happened last year. Like maybe he's 5 minutes late and there's a phone call to throw Fallon off, and all of a sudden he slips into the booth or something, maybe like that. But actually it's legit, because yeah, you remember Ben's older brother Kyle, the good guy who stood by during the bullying and didn't do anything? Well, he's dead.
They got Kyle.
Apparently he was in a car wreck 2 days ago and didn't survive. So Ben's not in a place where he can actually leave and do anything. So they're going to have to skip this year and hopefully meet up next year, which is terrible. He regrets this, but Fallon totally understands. Like, dire situation. Okay, fine. And she's heartbroken by the moment, but not because Ben lost his brother. It's because she's not going to be able to see Ben this year. We then switch back to Ben. Apparently, this all happened 3 months before the birth of his first child. Jordan is pregnant. They were married, and everyone, like the family, is gathering at Ben's place to get ready for the funeral and pay the respects and all that. Jordan is beside herself, can hardly be consoled. You've got family bringing food. There's an aunt and uncle that are doing what they can to help out around the house. And throughout all of this, Ben is kind of numb, just floating around, trying to put on a brave face for the sake of everyone else, when all of a sudden, Fallon shows up at the front door. And I'm gonna be honest, this is actually a really sweet scene, because Ben kind of has a breakdown and they go up to his room, and it doesn't turn into like an immediately sexual thing. He actually has a moment of vulnerability and cries into her chest, and it's a good scene. I gotta give credit where it's due. Although it does make me wonder how well Fallon is doing if she can afford a last-minute plane ticket like this. I shouldn't be surprised that he's even more appealing this year than last. He's all man now. Gone are the pieces of boy I could still catch a glimpse of the last time I saw him.
And when did you get so mature?
Ben and Fallon go out with Ian and some other guy named Tate. Honestly, I've forgotten who that is. And Miles. I don't know who these people are. Not very standout characters.
Dude, who the hell are you? Alex.
So they all go out for pizza and they just start discussing Ben's book, and they start comparing it to other stories they've heard, like Sleepless in Seattle or One Day. I have already mentioned Same Time Next Year myself, and we get another meta line about writing from Ben. It's a bit like Sleepless in Seattle, Tate says. I immediately shake my head. It's nothing like that. They only agreed to meet up once. True, it's like One Day then. That movie with Anne Hathaway. Again, I dismiss her comparison. That just focuses on one particular day every year, but the two people still interact throughout the year like normal. Fallon and I have no contact. I don't know why I'm being so defensive. I think writers just naturally become defensive when their ideas are compared to other ideas, even if it's done innocently. But mine and Fallon's story is one of a kind, and I feel somewhat protective of it. Very protective of it, actually. It sounds like this. I think it's important to remember the idea that there are no original stories anymore. As the saying goes, there are 11 stories in the English language and Shakespeare wrote 7 of them. In my view, people should focus more on characters and world building, very much the opposite of what Hoover did. She focused on plot, and oh boy, it doesn't work, because Her characters do totally normal things like this. I lift my finger to her mouth. You have something in your teeth. She bares her teeth and I wipe what looks like a piece of pepper from her tooth. All gone, I say, giving her a quick peck on the lips. This gets even weirder when you consider how little contact these two have actually had over the last 3 years. To the point where they are still, in fact, basically strangers. And she let him pick something out of her teeth. I wouldn't do that. And I'm engaged to a woman.
I'm normal!
Later that night, Fallon takes a shower at Ben's place and walks into the bedroom with him where he's waiting in his boxers on his bed. And she decides that she's going to do whatever Ben needs of her that night. Wink, wink. And he decides to put the moves on her by reading poetry. His eyes drop to my legs again and he begins to speak slowly, as if he's reciting poetry. The only sea I saw was the seesaw sea, with you riding on it. Lie down, lie easy, let me shipwreck in your thighs. His eyes drag up my body until they meet mine. Dylan Thomas, he says. Now that particular line is actually from, let me get this right, Dylan Thomas's Under Milk Wood, the last of his works, and apparently very well regarded. Like, as far as famous poems, he could certainly do worse than Thomas. And at his request, Fallon actually drops the shirt she's wearing on the floor and stands completely nude in front of him. And this plays around, like, the scene plays around with some sexual tension for a little bit. They go back and forth whether or not they're actually going to go all the way. They do eventually decide to make tonight the night, but not before dropping some pretty ridiculous lines. Ben actually says, forget the deal. He wants her phone number before she leaves in the morning, and she says that he can have it. She'll even buy an all-in-one printer with a fax machine just so she can give him that number as well. Baby.
Hey, baby.
He says, his lips forming a smile. You've already made this the best sex I've ever had, and I'm not even inside you yet. Yeah, nothing's a bigger turn-on than talking about fax machines. Keep in mind, fax is only 2 letters away from sex. Fallon, he whispers, moving his lips slowly across mine. Thank you for this beautiful gift. Now, rather than actually write out the sex scene, the book fades to black, and it's kinda clever the way that Hoover does this. He presses his mouth against my ear and whispers, no combination of written words could ever do this moment justice. I smile between moans. How are you going to write about it then? He kisses me softly right on the corner of my mouth. I guess I'll just have to fade to black. And then there's a scene break. And that clever moment, if you'll allow that, is kind of shattered when Fallon gives this description of, like, the morning after. I'm not sure if sex is supposed to make you feel like you just lost a piece of yourself to the person inside you, but that's exactly what it felt like. It felt as if the second we joined together, a tiny piece of our souls got confused, and a piece of his fell into me, and a piece of mine fell into him. It was by far the single most intense moment I've ever shared with another person. And this is when Ben realizes that he can't really go on without Fallon, so again, forget the deal. Forget even just the phone number. He actually wants to move to the same city as her so they can be together. Like, even the book isn't worth it if it means they can't be together. And it's a tender moment where Ben accepts that he's got to move on. Kyle's gone. His older brother is never there, to the point of why is he even in the story then? And it's kind of sweet up until the very end when it gets ruined by schmaltzy nonsense. He's serious. He actually wants to move to New York, and I want him there more than I've ever wanted anything. You're gonna need a jacket. His smile transforms his entire face. He reaches a hand up to my cheek and traces my jaw, brushing his thumb over my lips. And they lived happily ever after. Unfortunately, we're about halfway through the book, so of course things don't work out that well. At about 4 in the morning, Fallon goes down to the kitchen and sees Jordan there, who's finishing up a pizza, and starts talking about Fallon being the girl that Ben's writing the book about. Jordan is quite complimentary. He's a great writer. That has yet to be seen. But it's really good because Kyle was so happy for Ben when Ben was signed with his agent. And this is the first time that Fallon's ever heard about an agent, because apparently his book idea is so phenomenal that he's already got a contract signed. But then Jordan unloads for Fallon and confesses that now that Kyle's gone, she doesn't have anyone here in California, so she's going to have to move back in with her mother in Nevada, and she doesn't want to, and what's she going to do with the baby? Oh my god, it's so troubling. And then Ben walks down and says that she's not going anywhere. She is his sister, keep this in mind, and his nephew will be raised in the home that Kyle planned for him to be raised in. At that point, Fallon realizes that Ben cannot leave for New York with her, nor can she leave New York for him. So rather than simply talk to Ben about all of this, about her decision, Fallon secretly calls for a cab to take her back to the airport. Ben runs into Fallon and immediately starts begging her to stay, to not change her mind, to do something, that they can't leave yet. And the way that this is framed, there's something that's been consistent throughout the book so far. A lot of the emotion of the book has been very surface level, which is what I think the book, like, there's a very simplistic emotional drive to the book so far, and I think that's what a lot of the appeal for the audience is. Like, it's the type of hollow emotional stuff where it sounds neat or enduring or whatever on a first simple read, but when you actually start to scratch the surface, you realize that it doesn't actually work. And that's very much on full display in this chapter and the previous one, where Ben all but confesses his love for Fallon, and Fallon kind of obtusely brushes all that off, as we see throughout this chapter. And while Ben has been kind of a creepy weirdo for various sections up until this point, the third November 9th, the third year, he's actually been a lot more mature and a lot more sympathetic, a lot more easy to understand and not want to punch in the face. And he gets this really exposed vulnerability here in this chapter where he tries to convey his emotions and bargains with Fallon every way he can, and it is this really sorrowful, regretful thing, and he is very, very sympathetic for about a page and a half. I've never wanted to use physical force on a girl before, but I want to push her to the ground and hold her there until the cab drives away. Well, so much for looking cute.
I dig it when chicks run.
To a point, I can understand Ben being in this mindset. Teenage hormones and all will make you say and do things impetuously, very spur of the moment, so he's not fully thinking this through. To a point, I can excuse some of how he's feeling, but for him to externalize a lot of what he's saying, like this bit where he says, "No, Fallon, you can't just agree to love me and then take it back because you think it's not what's best for me. That's not how this works." Well, now he's actually putting thoughts on display, and it becomes something that Fallon can actually react to. The prose, the internal thoughts, are something that might not be good, might not be great for the reader to sympathize with, but on a character level, it's at least understandable. But then for him to actually start blurting this stuff out, well, then he starts losing sympathy a lot faster. The problem is, a lot of his internal thoughts here within the prose start to come off as really vindictive. Like, he goes through the standard five-step stages of grief very quickly, so he's already gone from bargaining to anger at this point. Fallon insists that Ben needs to be here where he can help support Jordan because she needs it more. And he needs to finish his book, otherwise the last 3 years mean nothing, which is a very shallow take on the whole situation because it could have led to a very meaningful relationship between the two of them, but whatever! And then Ben takes that and assumes that Fallon's just completely wrong. I don't know where this is coming from. I've never been angry at her before, but I am so fucking pissed because this hurts. It hurts to know we just shared what we did upstairs in my room, and then after giving it a little thought, she decides it didn't mean shit to her. That I don't mean shit to her. Now, I think what Hoover did when she was writing through this scene is she realized that Ben was coming off too aggressively. Normally what you would do is you would go back and try to edit what he said in order to make him more sympathetic and a little more understandable. What Hoover did, though, is just kind of barreled through, but then tried to backtrack within the prose itself. Her shoulders drop with her sigh. She gives her head a soft shake. Ben, I'm not walking away from this. I'm not doing anything we didn't agree to the first day we met. I'm the one sticking to the rules here. We agreed on 5 years. And yes, we had a little hiccup upstairs where we almost caved and I cut her off. A hiccup? I point to the house. Did you just refer to us agreeing to start a relationship as a hiccup? Her expression is immediately apologetic, but I don't want to hear an apology. I'm obviously in the wrong here because when I made love to her, I knew what was happening between us was something most people don't even know exists. And if she even remotely felt the same, there's no way in hell she would be saying these things right now. And this is why the book being written in present tense bothers me, because he is at this moment aware that he is in the wrong here. Despite that, he's going to barrel forward with this aggressive attitude against her. Not quite threatening her, but definitely lashing out. So if this had been written in past tense, you could have at least said, okay, well, this is recollection. He is reflecting on who he was and what he thought at the time and realized he was in the wrong. But because it's present tense, it's like, he knows he's being an ass, and he's going to keep being an ass anyway. What kind of character work is this? My stomach clenches and I want to double over in pain. But instead I hold steady and I offer her one last chance to prove to me the entire past date wasn't completely one-sided. But Fallon puts her foot down and says that they need to focus on their goals because they've already been through so much already. You need to be here for your family this year. You know that as well as I do, Ben. The last thing we need is a relationship over a cell phone, and that's exactly what will happen, because we'll spend every spare second wanting to talk to each other instead of focusing on our goals. We'll alter everything just to be together, and it shouldn't be that way. Not yet. We need to finish what we started.
I will finish what you started.
And Fallon tries to rationalize this by saying that this is exactly what Ben did for her the first year when he encouraged her to go off and pursue her dreams in New York. The one thing I want more than anything is for the whole world to laugh at you, Ben. I can hear the tears in her voice. And they can't do that if I don't do for you what you did for me the day we met. You let me go. You encouraged me to go. And I want the same for you. I want you to follow your passion instead of your heart. Now, this is very, very stupid because their situations have completely altered. They barely knew each other, less than they know each other now, on the first night, and Fallon already had an apartment lined up and plane tickets anyway. Like, of course she wasn't gonna just skip out on all of that for some guy she met in a restaurant, like, earlier at lunch. So the comparison doesn't work here, especially because we've seen things in first-person perspective from both of their viewpoints. They both deeply care about each other. We as the reader understand that. So we've both been in their heads. We know that this is full of crap from both of their perspectives. I don't understand what Fallon is doing from this whole follow your passion thing. Arguing you gotta be here for Jordan because she's about to give birth and won't have anyone else around her, okay. That one you've got a little more substance to argue with, but Fallon doesn't rely on that for kind of the final punch of the argument. This is especially made hollow considering that she's arguing that Ben needs to finish what he started with writing this book. This is the same person who said, it's fiction, you can make shit up. So Ben's ultimatum doesn't work. Fallon gets in the cab, drives off to the airport, and we're given this somewhat ominous line as the chapter closes. I curse at the empty street because for once, I get exactly what I deserve. And that is the end of the 3rd November. And it's curious. We wonder why he deserves this. But at this point, the emotions are so strained and so heightened that if you look at it through any kind of logic or you try to scratch beneath the surface of what's actually going on here, you realize that both of these characters are idiots. Ben never actually came out and said that he was in love with Fallon, and Fallon never considered Ben's feelings throughout all of this. She insisted on what she thought was best for him without ever consulting him on the matter. And this is when it starts to really start going downhill. The 4th, November 9th. In her darkness, she is silent. In my darkness, she screams. It sounds like a really horrifying image taken out of a slasher movie. You know what I want? Actually, I want everyone in the comments, tell me what your interpretations of these poems are. I'm curious to see what other people think of these. So it's been 1 year since Fallon broke Ben's heart, and she actually has a very big secret. She is no longer living in New York. She in fact moved back to Los Angeles just for him. Although there was a change in profession as well. Apparently she works as an acting coach now, because she was doing that for a while in, I guess, community theater near Broadway and had a lot of fun with it, so she's doing it professionally now. And as she waits in the restaurant, Fallon worries that Ben might still be pissed off from last year and might not even show up. But that's not really why she's nervous. I'm nervous because I know he will. He always shows up. But this year I have no idea where we stand. We left on really bad terms last year, and I take complete blame. But he has to understand that if the shoe were on the other foot, he would have done the same for me. If I had made such a huge declaration in the midst of so much suffering, he would have acknowledged that maybe I wasn't in the best place to make such a life-altering decision. And he certainly can't fault me for encouraging him to stay and help out his family. His brother had just died. His sister-in-law needed him. His nephew would need him. It was the right thing. He would have done the same for me. He just took it as hard as he did because he was already having such an emotional week. Now, kind of a drawback, like kind of a plus and minus of this book, is that because we see things from the alternate characters' perspectives, we understand that what Fallon just said is in fact nonsense, because that is not at all how Ben took it. At the same time, the plot kind of works because Fallon doesn't understand what she did, but the reader's perspective, the reader's interpretation of the moment is that both of these two are idiots, or at least that's how I took it, and their utter lack of communication is so damningly obvious, especially in this chapter. Like, there's no way these two realistically have a chance at actually forming a happy relationship at this point. But Ben does in fact show up, and he's not alone. With him is a very small child, his nephew, Oliver. Apparently he was born New Year's Day, so the whole holiday birthday celebration thing continues. And Fallon even likes that Ben seems to have the whole baby thing down. It's impressive and kind of sexy. So they start talking, and Fallon picks up that Ben is actually a little nervous. He certainly seems more nervous than he really should be, and she thinks that it's probably because things ended so badly last year. Well, unfortunately, this is just a continuation of Fallon not understanding the situation and why the current writing style doesn't really continue any sort of romantic chemistry between these two. The way that we get the altering perspectives works for a thriller level or some sort of a drama story, but not for a romance, because Fallon thinks this. He's more nervous than he should be, but we did leave things off on an awkward place last year. I worry that it isn't nerves plaguing him, but maybe a little bit of bitterness. I know I hurt him last year, but surely he's had time to understand why I did what I did. And hopefully he knows that walking away from him when he was in so much pain was probably harder on me than it was on him. I've spent the entire last year with a heavy heart because it's constantly on my mind. She has acknowledged that he was in a terrible place emotionally, and her leaving was definitely a factor in any kind of emotional strife he must have been feeling. And she still has the audacity to say that leaving was harder on her than it was on him. Like, we got things from Ben's perspective. No, it wasn't. And instead of adding any kind of reasonable doubt between these two, there's some sort of an external reason why they can't be together for whatever reason. It's Fallon making bad decision after bad decision. She moved back to Los Angeles. We don't know quite how long she's been here, I don't believe. And she has made no move to try to reach out to him at all. Just going along with the whole book inspiration idea as if that's possibly still a good plan. The conversation continues, and Fallon starts picking up on a few clues. For example, Ben treats Oliver like a father would treat a son. Oliver looks at Ben like he's his dad. Ben referred to himself and Jordan as a we, and they keep Oliver's baby monitor on a nightstand, which means they must share a bedroom. Fallon realizes that she has lost Ben to Jordan, which is weird on a number of levels. One, Fallon pushed Ben away, so she doesn't actually have a right to complain about this at all. Two, Ben called Jordan his sister, and he does in fact confirm in the next chapter that they are actually dating. Three, this isn't against the rules, because on the 1st, November the 9th, when they were discussing the ground rules of how they do this, they suggested that they should go throughout their lives as normal, which presumably would include dating. In fact, Ben insisted upon it. He insisted that Fallon go out and date a couple of guys. 5 dates, and she had to kiss at least 2 of them, remember? Are we to assume that that same courtesy didn't extend to Ben? He has to maintain celibacy, but she can go do whatever she wants? So Fallon, at this moment, does not have the right to complain. And while Ben does feel some sympathy because he never expected the relationship to Jordan to actually flourish from anything, but at the same time, he does hold a little bit of bitterness for Fallon. The only thing that matters to Fallon is the unexpected twist in our story. One neither of us saw coming. One neither of us even wanted. And one she's partly responsible for. I have to remember that. As much as she's hurting right now, she hurt me just as much, if not worse, when she chose New York over me.
You are coping and seething.
Fallon tries to leave because she's too emotionally distraught over this. She hasn't even mentioned that she moved back to Los Angeles yet, when Ben tries to beg her to, hang out for a minute and just give him a chance to explain. Explain what? She says quietly. Do you want me to stand here and listen to you explain how you didn't mean to fall in love with your dead brother's wife? Do you expect me to argue with you when you tell me it isn't just about what you want anymore, but about what's better for your nephew? Do you expect me to apologize for lying to you last year when I said I didn't want to love you? Each word of the last sentence to leave her mouth is like weights bearing down on me, sinking me to the bottom of a lake. She lied to me? And this emphasizes so much how bad an idea this entire plotline is on a character level. It doesn't make sense for these two to get so emotionally wrapped up when they are knowingly going out of their way not to communicate with one another. Proper communication in a relationship is one of the most important bedrock things that you can get down, and these idiots are doing everything they can to go out of their way to ignore that basic fact. They both leave the restaurant, Fallon trying to get out of there and Ben just following with Oliver in his arms. And he actually yanks her keys out of her hand to stop her from leaving. You can't leave hating me, I say, putting the keys back in her hand. Not after everything we've been. I don't hate you, Ben, she interjects. Her voice is offended and there are still tears streaming down her cheeks. This was part of the deal, wasn't it? She wipes at her eyes almost angrily and then she continues. We live our lives, we date other people, we fall in love with our dead brothers' wives. And in the end, we see what happens. We've reached the end, Ben. A little early, but it's definitely the end. I look past her, too ashamed to make eye contact with her. We still have 2 more years, Fallon. We don't have to end it today. I understand why Fallon is breaking down like this, because she didn't understand her own feelings and she wasn't willing to fall in love with someone before she turned 23. But to then lash out against that other person makes her look unreasonable. But of course, she's not the only one at fault. This is Ben's chapter, so we have to see things from his perspective about how he also blames Fallon for this. She shakes her head. I know, I promised, but I can't. There's no way in hell I'm putting myself through this again. You have no idea what this feels like, she says, holding her hand to her chest. Actually, Fallon, I know exactly what it feels like. I peg her with my stare, wanting her to see that I'm not taking all the blame for this. If she wouldn't have walked away last year and completely devastated me, I wouldn't have spent the majority of the year resenting her. I would never have put myself in a position with anyone, much less Jordan, to risk what I could have had with Fallon. But I thought Fallon only felt a fraction of what I felt for her. And he goes on about how he's heartbroken, how he can't breathe. But then that's when Ben finally puts 2 and 2 together. You see, Fallon didn't arrive in a cab, she arrived in her own car. Now, it could have been a rental, but that was never brought up as a possibility. So Ben demands an answer out of her, and she says that she moved back. Surprise! And here it actually reveals that she did move back about a month ago. And this news just breaks Ben. All of a sudden, all the heartbreak, all the frustration boils back up to the surface. And you would think that this would bring back some resentment back to the surface, but instead, Ben actually reflects and realizes that he doesn't feel towards Jordan what he used to feel towards Fallon, and all of those old feelings start to come back. He also realizes that Jordan doesn't love him the way that she loved Kyle, and he pleads with her, asking if she loves him, because he can't walk away from all of this until he knows that he's not alone in how he feels about her. But instead of deflecting and looking back at the past to say it was the right decision at the time or something like that, Fallon puts her foot down about how Ben is acting now. She looks up at me, vexed. "You didn't give me a choice this time, Ben. You showed up in love with someone else. You share another woman's bed. Your hands touch someone who isn't me. Your lips make promises against skin that isn't mine. And no matter who is at fault for that, whether it's mine for walking away last year or yours for not knowing I did it for your own good, none of it changes. It is what it is." And then Fallon gets in her car and insists that she won't be back next year, and she's sorry if this ruins the book, but she can't do this anymore. And Ben reveals the obvious truth. It was never about the book. It was always about her. The book was an excuse for them to see each other. Duh. Fallon is supposed to be observant. Remember that Sherlock Holmes bit that she did at the start of the book? How did she not piece this together? It was so obvious. And so that's the 4th year. She drives off and Ben doesn't pursue her. Ben instead realizes that all of his old feelings for Fallon, but all of the old feelings he has for Fallon come back to the surface, and Ben realizes that he's still in love with her. How am I supposed to go back to Jordan now when I no longer have a heart to give her? Now, going through this so far, do any of you feel sorry for Ben? If so, stop it, because we are now moving on to the 5th November the 9th, and this is when you're going to start to really detest him. My flaws are draped in her mercy, revered by her false perception, and with her lips upon my skin, she will undress my deception. This is probably the first time we've gotten one of these poem things that actually doesn't completely suck, and it actually has something to do with what we're about to get into. So, good job, Hoover. It only took you 191 pages to get it right. True to her word, Fallon is not going out to the restaurant to meet with Ben. She is done doing that. She has, in fact, gotten a new boyfriend, some guy named Theodore. And this is a quick side note, but Theodore's character can be summed up with, he wears funny pants. I'm not making that up. He wears pants with tiny embroidered whales on them, Fallon. And the 2 times I've gone out with you guys, all he does is tell stories about being raised in Nantucket.
Hey, you know, I once knew a man from Nantucket.
And?
Let's just say the stories about him are greatly exaggerated.
The pants thing is a running joke that just keeps coming back. It's the only memorable thing about this guy. So Fallon has moved back in with her old roommate Amber. Amber and her, I guess, still boyfriend Glenn are going out to celebrate or do something, and she insists that Fallon and Theodore come along and, they'll go to the club. Get Fallon out of the apartment so she can stop moping. So they get to the club. Theodore's wearing the pants with the whales on them. Keeps coming up.
Go get your drink somewhere else! Who is he to give me orders? I mean, look at him. In that shirt.
And then Amber gets 4 shots for the table and says to waking up November 10th and having no memory of the 9th. Little does Fallon know what fate has in store for her. Get the cat ready, because this scene's gonna get really bad. About half an hour goes by, and the shots are doing their job. Fallon has a good buzz going when they get approached by someone else. She thinks that it's Amber's boyfriend at first, but it's not. Brown eyes are staring back at me, and I suddenly want to push Theodore's hands off of me and crawl across the table. Fuck you, fate. Fuck you to hell. A slow smile spreads across Ben's face as he returns his attention to Theodore. Sorry to interrupt, Ben says, but I'm going from table to table asking couples a few questions for a paper I'm working on for grad school. Do you mind if I ask you two a few? Theodore, of course, has no idea what's going on, and Ben just plays innocent to the whole thing, even introduces himself to Fallon as if they've never met before. Now, the immediate question I was asking at this scene is, how the hell did Ben find out that Fallon was here? Kinda stalkerish. Maybe he bugged her phone or something. We've seen it done before. And that does get answered, sort of, but it's a mystery answering a mystery. We'll get to that in a bit. And this is an element that I believe Hoover's playing with to show that Fallon doesn't connect with other guys as well as she did with Ben, because they knew so much about each other. There was such a deep, meaningful connection between the two of them, despite barely actually talking. She's been on 4 dates with Theodore before, and Ben asks how long he's been living in Los Angeles, and Theodore says, going on 20 years. Fallon turns to him and says, I thought you grew up in Nantucket. Theodore reveals that he was born there, but he wasn't raised there. And something this minuscule might seem like it's easy to brush off, but it's used to show that there's not much of a connection, because she has technically been on more dates with Theodore than with Ben. I personally don't really count the half a date that they spent in the restaurant last year when she left before the food was even served. Or rather, without eating any food, whatever. Theodore asks Ben what his paper is on, and Ben says he's studying the probability of soulmates. Ben raises an eyebrow. You don't believe in soulmates? Theodore wraps his arm around me and leans back in his seat. Are you saying you do? Have you met your soulmate? Theodore glances around the room half-jokingly. Is she here with you tonight? What's her name, Cinderella? My eyes slowly make the journey to Ben's. I'm not sure I want to hear her name yet. He's eyeing me hard, trading glances with the fingers that are sliding up and down my arm. She's not here with me, Ben says. In fact, I was actually stood up by her today. Waited for over 4 hours, but she never showed.
That's rough, buddy.
This moment is supposed to come off as sweet. Like, Ben is such a patient guy. He waited for so long for the love of his life, and it doesn't really come off like that. Granted, patience is a very laudable trait. Let's say someone is caught up in traffic and you have to wait an extra half hour and you don't give them any guff when they show up. That's pretty good. But Ben showed up to a restaurant and waited for 4 hours for a woman who claimed that she wasn't going to show up. That's going beyond patient. That's going towards obsession. Again, it's one of those moments that's supposed to sound sweet until you think about it for half a second and you realize Ben needs to see a therapist. Well, all of this is too much for Fallon, so she heads off to the bathroom to take a little bit of a break. And she, at one point, comments in prose, I think we both know I'm hoping Ben follows me so he can explain what the hell he's doing here. I walk into the bathroom, and even though I don't need to pee, I do anyway. I'm wearing a skirt that Amber forced me to put on, and it's so easy to use the bathroom when you're in a skirt. It's stupid not to take advantage of the opportunity. Besides, I'm pretty sure I'm getting a cab home right after I punch Ben in the face, so I might as well use the restroom while I'm here. And she's nervous, she's a little shaky because she doesn't know what she's going to do. What's the story with Ben and Jordan? What's going on with the nephew? But as soon as she steps out of the bathroom, Ben is there, grabs her by the wrist, pulls her further down the hallway away from the crowd, and she, it doesn't say how this happens, but her back is up against the wall, and he asks the question, how serious is it with whale pants back there? His defining character trait is his pants.
What the hell are you doing back here? I ignored the bartender. I mean, look at him in that shirt. It's awful, just awful.
A crooked, smug grin spreads across his face, but as soon as it appears, it disappears, replaced by a flicker of disappointment. Why didn't you show up today? He asks. I can no longer tell the difference between the beat of my heart and the bass of the music. They are in perfect sync, one no louder than the other, thanks to Ben's proximity. I told you last year that I wasn't going to show up today. I glance down the hallway toward the club. It's dark back here, past the bathrooms, past the people. Somehow in a building full of warm bodies, we have complete privacy. How did you know I would be here tonight? He gives his head a dismissive shake. The answer to that question isn't nearly as significant as the answer to mine. How serious is it with this guy? Considering the creeper vibes that Ben has already put out in previous sections in the book, I think that Fallon's question is much more pertinent. How did he find her here? Especially because he already had an answer. She said she wasn't going to show. Now, early on when these two first met, Fallon went on a little tirade about how she doesn't like particular cliches in romance novels. Okay. Except we then get this moment, which is absolutely a cliche out of a romance novel. That's nice, Ben. I need to get back to my date. I try to push past him, but he leans in closer, sandwiching me against the wall. His forehead meets the side of my head. Don't be like that, he whispers into my ear. I've been through hell today trying to find you. Eventually the question comes up, what happened to Jordan? Is Ben still dating her? And he indicates that if he had a girlfriend, he wouldn't be standing here trying to convince Fallon to come home with him. And we as the reader understand that Ben probably did this because after last year he realized that he still loved Fallon and it wouldn't be fair to Jordan if he was dating her. But this shred of nobility is overshadowed by the way that Ben is acting in trying to press Fallon into saying yes. Fallon realizes that she's struggling against her baser urges because deep down she is still attracted to Ben, but she doesn't want to get hurt again. So, but I'm stronger than my hormones. I have to be. I can't go through another heartbreak like the one I'm still healing from. The wounds are still so fresh, as if he's clawing them open with his bare hands. Come home with me, he whispers. No, 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 Fallon. I shake my head back and forth with immense effort in order to ensure I don't accidentally nod. No, Ben, no. This past year has been the hardest of my life. You can't expect me to just fall back into step with you because you showed up here tonight. He runs the back of his fingers across my cheekbone. I don't expect that, Fallon, but I do pray for it. Every night, down on my knees to any god who will listen.
Blood for the blood god!
And then we get the scene that you could tell was edited from the previous version where Ben gets a little handsy. Fortunately, it's been changed so that Fallon never actually says no. She actually gives some indication that she does really enjoy the attention Ben is giving her. And then they find a storage room and play 7 Minutes in Heaven. And we get another scene of some sexual tension as they play around for a little bit. And it's a brief scene, it's serviceable. Until Fallon decides it's time to leave, she opens the door handle and Amber is just there, just checking out random storage closets, I guess. Apparently Theodore is looking for her, because, oh yeah, she's actually on a date with somebody. Fallon gets dragged back to the table and Ben follows along, plopping down at the end of the table as if he's just part of this friend group. Considering things from Theodore's perspective, this is really odd. Amber and Glenn have met Ben before, so they at least know what's going on, but Theodore never really questions this. Like, hey, you just walked off with my date for a couple of minutes, and now she's panting and red-faced. What's going on? Instead, the conversation turns to the progress of Ben's writing, and he says that he's had a really bad case of writer's block for the last year, hasn't written a word in 365 days. But oddly enough, he just had a major breakthrough. Imagine that, Amber says, rolling her eyes. I lean forward, deciding to join in on this cryptic conversation. You know, Ben, writer's block can be a tricky thing. Just because you had a breakthrough a few minutes ago doesn't mean it's permanent. He pretends to give my comment a moment of thought, but then he shakes his head. No, I know a breakthrough when I have one. And I'm certain that what I experienced a few minutes ago was one of the most mind-blowing breakthroughs known to man.
I'm gonna finger bang bang you into my life.
You know, it's almost alarming how much utilization I get out of that one clip. But Ben comes clean and reveals that he's not actually writing a paper. And the reason he knew to show up here is because he ran into Glenn. Theodore, Ben says, interrupting him. You seem like a nice guy. Thanks, Theodore says, smiling. Let me finish, Ben says, holding up a finger in warning. Because you're about to hate me. I lied. I'm not writing a paper. He points at Glenn. This guy told me earlier today where to show up tonight so that I could find the girl I'm supposed to spend the rest of my life with. And I'm sorry, but that girl just so happens to be your date. And I'm in love with her. Like, really in love with her. Crippling, debilitating, paralyzing love. So please, accept my sincerest apologies because she's coming home with me tonight. I hope. I pray. Ben shoots me an endearing look. Please? Otherwise this speech will make me look like a complete fool, and that won't be good when we tell our grandkids about this. He points out his hand for me to take, but I'm as frozen in place as poor Theodore is. On the next page, Glenn confirms that Ben showed up at his apartment looking for Fallon, and he just started chatting with Glenn, and apparently Glenn found him funny, and that's why Glenn told him where they were going to be at the club. But the question that raises is, how did Ben know where Glenn lived? And that question never gets answered. It's one of those don't think about it too hard sorts of moments, but I'm sorry, logistics is still a part of storytelling. You also got to wonder, how well does Glenn actually know Ben at this point? Does he know for a fact that Ben is an alright guy? How much has Fallon talked about Ben? She certainly must have seemed heartbroken after last year, so is this a reasonable thing for Glenn to have done, revealing that they were going to be at the club? How does he know that Ben isn't some crazed stalker? Because Glenn and Ben have known each other even less than Glenn and Fallon, and the rhyming of Glenn and Ben just made me realize how lazy some of the nomenclature would have been, which is something that I would have praised about Hoover before all this. Like, she's come up with some pretty good names for a lot of her characters in a lot of other books, but you know, you start looking for patterns, and a lot of it rhymes. There's Kyle in this, and one of the protagonists in another book is Ryle. I don't know, that's a tangent. But this declaration of love pisses Theodore off, and he actually starts a fight in the club. Decks Ben, and even during the fight, Ben is actually like struggling to speak, asking Fallon if she's gonna come home with him or not. Oh my god, this is kind of psychotic. Bouncers kick them out of the club. The entire group goes outside, and Fallon admits that she doesn't actually know how she feels about all of this, and she needs a little bit of time to process everything, and Theodore doesn't take it well. Theodore cocks his head as if he's shocked by what he just heard. Figure it out? He shakes his head. I don't have time for this shit. He starts to walk in the opposite direction, but he's still within earshot when he mutters, "You aren't even that pretty." And then Ben runs at Theodore and punches him, and then Glenn rushes Theodore and punches him, and then Amber takes her shoe off and throws it at him, saying, "I hate your stupid pants." I can tell by the soothing sound of his voice that he's worried. Theodore hurt my feelings. "I'm fine, Ben. That guy's insults about my appearance don't carry much weight when he willingly wears those pants." But the declaration of love, the stalking, the fighting some guy in a parking lot, it's all just perfect for Fallon, and that's apparently the way to her heart, because as I pass Ben and head for the parking lot, I narrow my eyes at him. "You have a lot of explaining to do, though. A lot, and even more groveling." "I'm very capable of both of those things," Ben says, following after me. "And you have to cook me breakfast," I add. "I like well-done bacon and over-easy eggs." And Ben responds with a quip saying, "Explain myself, then grovel, then nakey, eggs and bakey." You really have to wonder where he lies on the cockiness to confidence spectrum. After they drop off Amber and Glenn, there's a bit of silence in the car until Ben eventually says that he needs to apologize and he should not have said those things. She shakes her head, silently interrupting me. "Don't take it back. I thought it was admirable the way you were honest with Theodore. Most men would be too chicken to say anything and would just steal the girl behind their friend's back." She had no idea what I even feel bad about. I wasn't apologizing for that. I'm apologizing because I should have never said I was in love with you out loud like that when the words weren't spoken directly to you. You deserve more than a secondhand "I love you." Ben gives a lengthy explanation about his situation with Jordan and why he felt the way that he did when Fallon left at the end of the third year. The short version is that Oliver became something to fill the void in both his and Jordan's heart. They found a connection through that, and while it was good, it didn't solve all of his problems in the long run. I mean, there was even a part of me that believed you would be happy for me when we met up the following November, because I thought maybe that's what you wanted, was for me to move on and stop holding on to what you viewed as this fictionalized relationship we created when we were 18. But then, when I showed up that day, the last thing I expected was for you to be hurt like that. and the second you figured out that I had been seeing Jordan, I could see in your eyes how much you really did love me, and it was one of the worst moments of my life, Fallon. One of the worst fucking moments, and I can still feel the wounds your tears left in my chest every time I breathe. Ben explains his side of things from when Fallon left till now, and while it does clear things up, the problems their decisions made were so obvious that anyone should have been able to see it coming. They each made assumptions about the other, Fallon thinking a year away from her would be good for Ben, and Ben thinking Fallon wouldn't react to him being with someone else. And these assumptions led them to making terrible choices that the audience could see coming from a good distance off. You don't need to be clever to understand why it's a bad decision, and because there's that barrier for the observant reader, these characters are now tainted by stupid choices. Can they work their way out of the muck? Yes, but it needs to be satisfying and logical, not just surface-level emotional. Fallon also gives her update. She's got really good friends, she loves school, she loves her job, she has 1.5 great parents, which makes me wonder, what is the status between her and her father? Did she ever follow through with that homework assignment to go talk to Donovan again? What is her relationship with her father right now? Now, the parent thing is obviously in reference to him. She still loves her mother. The question is she making up with her father? Is this a glass half full or half empty situation? Is she keeping him at arm's length? Does she not talk to him at all and only considers him a father in the legal sense? So the explanations wrap up. They both shared some fun times in bed, and Fallon does some math, figuring out that they've only spent about 28 hours together total since they met. That's more than enough time to know if you love someone, I say. Ben also explains the tattoo that he got a little bit. He says that he got it in that moment because he knew that he had fallen in love with a girl for the first time. Like real, selfless love. I mean, that's how he sees it. He's very wrong in that interpretation. But whatever. But he doesn't really explain what it means, because there is a degree of meaning behind the tattoo. It's the word poetic in the music staff, and he just says that it's for personal reasons. He'll explain it one day. But then we get an ominous cliffhanger, and this time when we finish, we don't talk afterwards. We both close our eyes, and I know that when I wake up next to her tomorrow morning, I'm going to make it my mission to forgive myself for all the times I withheld the truth from her in the past, after I make her breakfast. So unfortunately, the after I make her breakfast is kind of a speed bump, like a sudden barrier to what was otherwise actually not a bad cliffhanger. But this is when Fallon discovers the truth. She can't wait for breakfast. She actually wakes up in the middle of the night, quite hungry, and decides to walk down to Ben's refrigerator, but wants to grab one of his shirts first, and that's when she notices a manuscript sitting on a box, like on a top shelf. And the manuscript is, in fact, November 9, the book that Ben has spent all this time writing. And she knows that this is a violation of privacy, and it's not a good way to start a relationship, but hey, one scene can't be that bad, right? And I will cut Ben a little bit of slack. This is presumably a first draft, so your first draft isn't going to be wonderful. I saw a quote some time back. The purpose of a first draft isn't to be good, it's to be written. You touch things up in editing, and that's understandable. But of all the sections that Fallon could have possibly turned to in who knows how many pages, she finds the scene that explains why Kyle punched Ben during the second year, and we never got that answer. Like, what was the reason for that? And here's that explanation. Kyle looks away, running his hands down his face in frustration. When he turns around again, I'm not prepared for what happens. He punches me hard, and I slam into the wall behind me. His hands are pressed against my shoulders, and he's pinning me against the wall. Does she know, Ben? Does she have any idea that you're the one who started the fire? That you're the reason she almost died? And okay, as far as twists go, that's not bad. Now, I'm sure that there are plenty of people who figured this out before they actually got to this moment, but as far as setup, there was nothing to really indicate this. And I think that that's actually a really good point, like a really good technique to play with. Why would we ever suspect Ben of setting the fire that scarred Fallon. It's an illogical leap to make until you start considering meta things like how the story structured is all that anyway. But of course you also have to wonder, is this just a fictionalized thing that Ben is playing around with? Like maybe there's some dark twist for the story he's writing and he didn't actually set it in real life. Well, but why would he do this? Doesn't he know how personal that story is to me? I can't believe he would try to capitalize on such an awful tragedy. Oh my god, I can't believe James Cameron directed Titanic and capitalized on such an awful tragedy. No one has ever considered that before. And Fallon starts to put the pieces together because this can't be true. She met Ben 2 years after the fire, right? I laugh at myself. It's not true. He didn't meet me until 2 years after the fire. There was no way he could have been there. Besides, what are the chances he would run into me on the anniversary of the fire exactly 2 years later? He would have had to have been following me. He wasn't following me. Was he? And so, thinking that maybe this is just some made-up element that Ben is including for the sake of drama in the story, she goes back to the prologue and starts the manuscript over from there. And I'm not going to read this whole thing. It's not great. It opens up like a research paper more than an actual story. But again, first draft, I'll let it slide. Presumably first draft, I should say. The key element comes at the very end of the prologue. Everything is connected. And it all begins on November 9th, 2 years before I came face to face with Fallon O'Neill for the very first time. November 9th, the first and last time my mother would die. November 9th, the night I intentionally started the fire that almost claimed the life of the girl who would one day save mine. So this is confirmation that he started the fire, so it seems that's certainly how Fallon takes it. And I might as well just cut through this. And skipping ahead a little bit, it's an exaggeration to say that he intentionally started the fire. It's something that Hoover included here the way she did because it sounds better in the moment, but it's not accurate and it's not something that Ben would have actually written. But yes, this means that November 9 is the romance story of a girl and the boy who set her on fire. You see, Ben just couldn't resist the hunka burnin' love. You could say the relationship had a very fiery passion. Ben lights up Fallon's life. Fallon tries to leave, but Ben confronts her and just apologizes and asks her not to go. And he says that, he loves her so much, please don't leave me. But Fallon can feel the bile rising in her throat. She can't stomach the sight of Ben. And just the response she gives is terrible. Benton James Kessler, you do not love me. Never speak those words again. Not to me, not to anyone. Those 3 words are a disgrace when they fall from your mouth. How am I supposed to read this with a straight face? It's so terrible. But Fallon's already called a cab. She jumps inside. Ben runs to the cab and shoves the rest of the manuscript into the door. Fallon doesn't give him a chance and just throws the manuscript papers out of the door. It took 4 years for me to fall in love with him. It only took 4 pages to stop. Almost sounds like it's not a really good relationship at that point, huh? Hoover is unintentionally creating an argument against the couple in her book. Because remember, this is a romance. We're supposed to be rooting for these two to come together in the end. This isn't like, and I hate that I can use this as a good example, but this isn't like the Notebook where the romantic pair can't be together for societal reasons. Because if I recall correctly, the woman was already in an engaged, she was already engaged, and the guy was just some country bumpkin, and there were societal pressures that meant they couldn't really be together. So okay, you've got an external force there, but these characters are terrible people or complete idiots. Now, considering the rant that Ben went on about how authors don't like getting their works compared to other stories, I think that there might be some reflection on Hoover's part there. She might not actually like hearing her story compared to other things, which is why it gives me great pleasure to compare her book to something else, Endless Love by Scott Spencer. Now this one is a classic, published in 1979. This one did get a movie adaptation. The movie was awful. Like, the movie itself wasn't bad, but as an adaptation it was terrible. This is the story about David and Jade, and they're like young high school sweethearts. They're exploring love and romance and sex with each other, and it's this glorious thing until David gets banished from seeing Jade by her father because he set their house on fire. But David cannot stay away from Jade. Throughout the years, he follows her, he sends her letters, he obsesses about her, and that's a bad thing. The story frames that as a bad obsessive love. David cannot leave this woman alone. He cannot take no for an answer and leave, and he is constantly shown in the wrong for this. Spencer was very clever in how he framed all of this, because there is never a doubt that David is in the wrong for all of this. There is never a doubt that he does not deserve a happy ending. We are given almost the same character in Ben here, where he did start a fire, he set her house on fire, and then can't take no for an answer. He keeps following Fallon and will not leave her alone, no matter how much she actually insists that he does. To the point where in the 6th year, she actually gets a restraining order against him. Like, apparently this happened shortly after she got in the cab. Like, I think she goes to the police station or something shortly after this, and yeah, she drove straight to the police station and filed a restraining order against Ben. And I'm just gonna let you know now, Hoover is going to try to take this relationship, this unhealthy, horrid relationship between these two idiots, and try to salvage it and try to make it sympathetic in one of the most perplexing, unsatisfying endings I've ever read in any book. So, 6th November 9th, the final year. Fate, a word meaning destiny. Fate, a word meaning doom.
Tonight at 11.
Doom! It's 1 year later, and Fallon has chosen to spend this year's November 9th isolating herself in her apartment. She gets a supportive message from Amber. She gets a supportive message from her mother. All that matters is that she's not going outside, so she doesn't have to worry about somehow running into Ben. And she is still rattled from the revelation that Ben was the one that started the fire. She trusted him, she loved him, she believed him wholeheartedly, and it blew up in her face. I keep telling myself it'll get easier, that I'll meet someone someday who will be able to blind me to thoughts of Ben, but so far, I won't even bring myself to trust someone enough to flirt with them. So she has been deeply affected by Ben's obfuscation. Effectively, she has been, like, a more extreme reading of this would be she has been re-traumatized by all of this, by the revelation that Ben was at fault for taking away the best parts of her life, as she once put it. Now, this scene is right after midnight, very early on November 9th, and she gets a sudden knock on the door. Kind of creepy. We're definitely getting into a much more dangerous thriller sort of vibe instead of a romance here. So, not a very good image that Hoover is setting here, especially considering past context. But she opens the door, no one's there, doesn't help the image, but there is a box.
It's a pipe bomb!
Yay! And you guessed it, this is from Ben, violating his restraining order. Way to respect boundaries, Ben. Nothing moistens the ladies up like violating a restraining order. And on the inside flap of the box is a letter from Ben addressed to Fallon. Fallon, I've spent most of my life preparing to write something as important as this letter, but for the first time, I don't feel like the English language has developed enough letters in the alphabet to adequately express the words I want to say to you. When you left last year, you left with my soul in your hands and my heart in your teeth, and I knew I would never get either of them back. You can keep them. I don't really need them anymore. I am not writing this letter in hopes that you will forgive me. You deserve better. You always have. Nothing I can say would ever make me feel worthy enough to walk on the same ground you walk upon. Nothing I can do would ever make my heart worthy enough to share a love with yours. I am not asking you to seek me out. I am just asking that you read the words on the pages in this box in hopes that it can allow you, and maybe even me, to walk away from this with as little damage as possible. You may not believe me, but all I want is for you to be happy. That's all I've ever wanted, and I'll do anything to make that happen for you, even if it means helping you forget me. The words you're about to read have never been read by anyone but you, nor will they ever be read by anyone but you. This is the only copy. You can do whatever you want with it when you're finished, and I know you owe me nothing, but I'm not asking you to read this manuscript for me. I want you to read it for yourself, because when you love someone, you owe it to them to help them be the best version of themselves that they can be, and as much as it crushes me to admit this, the best version of you doesn't include me. Ben. It's a good thing that letter finished when it did. Ben was running out of cliches. And Fallon is so off-put by this. She is such an emotional wreck from what Ben did, the trust that he violated, that she says, not only will Ben never break these walls back down, but I'm afraid he's forced me to build them up so thick and high that I'll be hiding behind them forever. At this point, the steps that Ben would have to go through in order to win back Fallon would be so Herculean that they would defy all realism or any sense of actual grounded narrative. Like, we would require an act of God at this point. Consider things from Fallon's point of view. She was traumatized by the fire. She put her trust in the man who actually set the fire, got re-traumatized as a result of that. God only knows what kind of a shell she hides herself behind on regular interactions with people she doesn't know. As she said, she's too nervous to actually go and even flirt with other guys. But Fallon does, for the moment, come to the correct conclusion. She owes Ben nothing, so she just leaves the manuscript on the kitchen counter and doesn't even look at it. Fallon then goes to bed and wakes up just before noon. And her mother is there. She was going to swing by and drop off breakfast, and apparently she found the manuscript and started going through it, which Fallon sees as an invasion of privacy, which is a little hypocritical since she violated Ben's privacy when she read the manuscript in his closet, but whatever. And it's not just that her mother is reading these pages, she's reading and crying over them because the manuscript is so deep and meaningful. It's wonderful, darling. The mother is perplexed that Fallon hasn't read any of this and asks if Fallon did love Ben at some point. Her mouth twitches and she blinks fast, twice, like she's trying not to cry. She's still brushing her thumb across my cheek. Her eyes deviate from mine and she scrolls over the scars on my face and neck. I'm not going to pretend that I know what you've gone through, but after reading those pages, I can assure you that you aren't the only one who was scarred in that fire. Just because he chose not to show you his scars doesn't mean they don't exist. She picks up the box and sets it on my lap. Here they are. He's put his scars on full display for you, and you need to show him the respect he showed you by not turning away from them. Hi, Mom! Did you forget the part where he set me on fire? No, I'm gonna go with the mom's an idiot here. I don't care what Ben's situation is. Ben did not start in a great way. He started in an okay way for a character, but he's not very compelling. Like, he's not a likable romantic interest. I have no reason to root for him in this situation. And he's been getting worse and worse throughout the story, to the point where he should legitimately be in jail. I think it's weird that he's not. The man committed arson, intentional or not. Actually, what was the paperwork like when Fallon was setting that up? Like, I've never signed up for a restraining order myself, so I don't know what the process is. Do they ask, why do you want this? And would Fallon be obligated to say he started a fire? Also, what's this you need to show him the respect he showed you by not turning away thing? Like, the fuck? Fallon owes him any respect after what he did. Second off, there is no reason to assume that anything that Ben has written in this manuscript is in fact truthful. Like, for context in the story, yes it is, but coming at it from the perspective of this is a manuscript, you have no reason to believe Ben, considering the mountains of lies that he has told up to this point. Granted, they're all lies by admission, but they're lies all the same. I don't like Fallon as a character. I think that she makes rash decisions and doesn't really consider the needs or feelings of others. But standing on principle, Ben is a bad person. Like, legally, morally, however you want to define it. And then we go into something that I wish I could say was a clever move, because Hoover, for the next several dozen pages, actually puts us through Ben's manuscript. And it's not good. It does reveal a good portion of Ben's backstory, about this many pages. Small nitpick, but none of these are numbered, so keeping track for my notes was more of a challenge than I liked. But this is, figuratively speaking, Ben trying to dig his way out of a hole that he dug himself. And I don't think he does a very good job trying to breach the surface again. We will go through this and see what everyone's opinion on it is, but yeah, this is Ben's novel, Chapter 1. Most people don't know what death sounds like. I do.
I like to be called by my goth name, Night Pain. Oh, God.
This is actually a pretty rough opening line, because you'll notice something that Ben does frequently throughout the story. He is very egocentric. A lot of what he does centers around what he wants, what he considers. The moment the first night when he was going to take Fallon out to Chateau Marmont, or whatever that was, he was very insistent on the dress that Fallon would wear. You know, like, he's going to be paying for dinner, so he should get to choose what he looks at. Granted, that was framed as a joke, but it still is part of a larger pattern. You have Ben's insistence when he invites himself to the club to hang out with Fallon, or the way that he pushed himself on her that entire night. The fact that he insisted himself on a conversation between Fallon and her father the day that they officially met. Ben constantly puts himself first and foremost while claiming to put Fallon first and foremost. If that was the case, he would have left her alone years ago. Instead, he keeps putting himself out there in an attempt to get her back, to earn her favor, to get her to finally fall in love with him. Now, do you remember how egocentric Fallon's father was in that opening scene, about how he kept talking about himself and how he kept putting his own talking points and conversation pieces out there well before he ever asked, by the way, why did you want to meet me for lunch? In this way, Fallon has in fact fallen for a effectively younger version of her father. She, for some reason, has this egocentric boy in front of her who behaves very similar to her father as far as the whole ego-driven nonsense goes, and she has, for better or worse, fallen for this guy. And now we have an argument for whether or not they should actually wind up together again in the end. Also, I'm sorry, but this opening line is horribly pretentious. Most people don't know what death sounds like, but I do. And effectively, he says that death sounds like absence. And, like, I can understand that perspective, but it sounds sophomoric. To proclaim that most people don't know what death sounds like when it's just the concept of absence is just really shallow. Like, Ben is not doing himself any favors by opening a story like this. Now, this is unfortunately going to get into some dark stuff, because we get Ben's full backstory on display here, and some of it's partially tragic, but I still have a lot of criticism for how it was presented. So I'm just going to put this generalized warning up on screen here. So Chapter 1 of this story is all about how Ben discovered how his mother died, because she died when he was 16 on November the 9th. Presumably that was a conscious decision, because that was the same day that Dylan Thomas died, and she was she had a master's in poetry and was a big fan of his. The thing that's unusual about it is that she shot herself in the head, and Ben lived with her and never heard the gunshot. Like, does death really sound like absence at that point? Well, I guess it does if you've got soundproof bedrooms or something. And there is a but Ben was so shaken by the moment that he never bothered to read it before the police came by and put it into evidence. There's no indication that, like, this happened when Ben was out hanging with friends and then it came back to a quiet house or something. I don't understand the timeline of events. It sounds like this is just very sloppily etched together in the hopes that no one will notice it. But we do get an explanation for the poetry tattoo that Ben has on his wrist. It was a matching tattoo that his mother got when she fell in love with his father. Another problem going through this is that the tone of the story seems really off. And I don't know if this is a conscious decision that Hoover made because she wanted Ben to come off as an inexperienced writer, or maybe he was in need of an editor or something. But we have this long description about him discovering his mother's body. It is tragic. And then he drops this line. I think I'm mostly just confused. She seemed happy most of my life. Sure, there were days she was sad, relationships that went south. My mother loved to love, and up until the moment she blew her face off, she was an attractive woman. If we have this somber moment, then why would you deflect with what sounds like a joke at her expense? This is something that I see a lot of modern writers get wrong. They don't understand the idea, the importance of letting certain emotions stick with you for a moment. This is something that a lot of people complain about in modern Marvel writing, where you always have to have a joke in place. It's part of the reason why a lot of people complained about Thor: Love and Thunder. Sometimes it is less important to have a joke to elevate certain emotions, to make the audience perhaps feel happy or have a quick chuckle. Sometimes it's important to actually let them feel miserable or sad for a little while.
Stop Get off me! God damn it! Let me get him out of there!
It's okay, Marcus. It's okay. Come on. We gotta go now. Your father still needs us.
And because of that, it resonates with the audience on an empathic level. We feel that sorrow in that moment. And because of that, the moment sticks with us. If you offset a sobering moment with a bad line or a bad joke, it derails the otherwise stable emotion that we were going for. And the scene is lessened as a result. When writing emotion into a story, you have to consider what effect you are trying to convey to the reader. What do you want them to feel in this moment? And realize structurally what your prose and your dialogue and all of that is building up to in that moment. Are you trying to make them feel sad? Then don't tell a stupid joke. Are you trying to enrage them with some particular injustice? Well, it's a bad time to have some random nonsense happen from just off screen. But once the shock wears off, Ben starts digging around his mother's personal effects to try to find out why she did this, and she comes across some emails. Apparently, she was in a relationship with someone named Donovan O'Neill. We get a scene break as Fallon takes a breather to recover, takes a shower, and then gets back into chapter 2. Ben's brothers finally get to the house, and they all start talking with each other and reconvening, and we get this really gross line. We sit around the kitchen table and talk about anything except why our mother hated her life more than she loved us. This has to stop. Ben's mom hasn't been established as a character in the story in any meaningful capacity, so this only comes off as blaming the victim. This is supremely fucked up, Being angry and confused in the moment, I get, but Ben has had several years to consider the words to put in his story to reflect how he felt about his mother, and this is how he chose to describe her. Considering this and the blew her face off comment, it almost sounds like Ben hates his mother. And yes, this nonsense is all written in present tense as well, so I think what Hoover is going for is trying to capture Ben's emotion at the time that this all happened, but I'm sorry, it just comes across as really callous to me. Again, we don't know that much about Ben's mother as a person or Ben's connection to his mother. She has been absent for the entire run of the book up until this moment. I can understand anger in this moment. That is a very reasonable reaction, all things considered. The problem is, in a little bit, we get a description of a decision that the mother made, and it's the wrong one by any metric. So, I am sorry, there is nothing positive about the mother in this book. You'll see in a little bit. So Ben starts stalking Donovan for a little bit, finds out where he lives, drives to his house late on November 9th, and seems to witness Donovan getting notification that Ben's mother had died. Again, this is never confirmed, so take it for what weight that it has. Ben, in his hormonal, youthful naivete, gets upset that Donovan doesn't seem angry at the situation. Like, he punches the air and then he just kind of slumps over and goes inside. He also throws a rag and kicks a gas can into the yard. And Ben, for some reason, thinks that it would have been more reasonable for Donovan to take his anger out on his car. And then Hoover ruins the image that she was building, because up until this point, the story has been present tense, so we could assume that this was all what was going through Ben's mind as he was experiencing it in real life. This wasn't him recollecting his story. This is him writing down a first-person account of where his head was at the moment, except for this part. I should punch the hood of the car for him. And even though I know nothing good will come of this, I'm already out of my car and halfway across the road before I tell myself it's not a good idea. But when it comes to a battle between your adrenaline and your conscience, adrenaline always wins. That right there, that is retrospective commentary. Ben is commenting on what his actions as a 16-year-old were, that they were irrational because he's just listening to his adrenaline, not conscience or common sense or anything. So if that's the case, if he is writing present-day commentary on everything that happened in the past, then that means that he should have more control over what he actually puts down on paper, which means that he shouldn't be disrespecting his mother the way that he has been up to this point. Anyway, Ben takes the gas can, pours some of the gas over the car, and eventually sets that on fire, and then just leaves and smiling to himself, thinking he's accomplished something. But eventually he passes a couple of fire trucks and looks back and realizes that the fire is much bigger than it should have been. Like, this isn't something that just consumed a car anymore. It's spread to the house. And Ben doesn't go back to try to help at the fire or fix anything that he's done. He realizes this was very much a criminal act, so he goes back home, talks to Kyle, and Kyle convinces him to never speak a word of this ever again. But not before they get some news reports on what had happened, because they reveal that Fallon was inside the house and actually suffered 4th-degree burns over 30% of her body. Now, a 4th-degree burn is much more significant than your standard 3rd-degree burn. 4th-degree burns are extreme damage to the point where there's a possibility of exposed bones, permanent nerve damage, possible amputation in really bad cases. And that's just 30% of Fallon's body. We don't know the extent of the damage for the rest of it. Like, there could have been a degree of 3rd degree or 2nd degree burns, over other parts of her. And Ben considers self-deletion as well. And this is also tragic that we get another break after the paragraph and Fallon barely makes it to the toilet before she throws up. She realizes that a lot of the reason why she hated her father was because she thought he was responsible for the fire. So she blamed him and never really made an honest attempt to reconnect to him because he was her acting coach for however many years. Ben ruined that on more than one level, and he never confessed to it. Not until now, anyway. So Fallon makes an effort to reach out to her father and suggest having breakfast the next day. Okay, I think I see what Hoover is going for. Ben came forward with the truth, and now everything is healing. Except it wouldn't have had to in the first place if he hadn't fucked up on a criminal level. Also, there's a mistake here as Ben considers what he's supposed to do with his life at this point because, you know, his brothers aren't around the house anymore. I think about this for a second, about how neither of them lives here. Ian is in flight school. Ben just started college. That's supposed to be Kyle. This made it into the finished product of not just this, but the ebook. And Ben goes on another ramble against his mother, saying that she had a black hole in her heart, to which Ian grabbed him by the shirt and pushed him against the bed. But this is because Ben never got a chance to read the self-deletion note. How the hell am I going to keep this monetized? According to the note, Ben's mother had ovarian cancer and realized that, yeah, they could go through treatment and all that stuff, but it would take a while. It probably wouldn't actually kill the cancer, and it would just drain funds, and she didn't want that for her kids, so she self-deleted herself before all of that could happen. Now, the core problem with this, and the reason I don't like the mother as a character, is she never bothered to reach out to her sons and be upfront with them. My own biases are on display here. I got to say goodbye to my mother before she died, and I was incredibly lucky in that regard. It made the difference. Like, if it had been sudden, I don't know what state I would have been in. And again, we go back to how the mother here is not a real character. What reason did she have to make this decision to not even talk to her children, man? Like, I'm sorry, but this is such a phenomenally stupid decision to make. Like, I'm not even talking about the self-deletion thing at this point. Not talking to your kids about this, not giving them a chance to say goodbye would mess them up so badly. And yes, of course they would try to convince her not to, but in the end, to not even give them that option is supremely damaging, as is the case with Ben, who apparently, chapter 4 takes place 2 years later when he's 18, and he spends a good amount of his time drunk. Ben decides to go visit his mother's grave, where he runs into Donovan, of all people, who replaces the wilted flowers with new ones at her headstone, which is weird because we've never seen this, in the few moments we've seen of him, the few things we know about Donovan, we know he's a supremely selfish person, to the point where he remembers that this woman that he may have been having a fling with died 2 years ago, but he doesn't remember the anniversary of the fire that scarred and traumatized his daughter. And that's another thing. We don't actually know what the relationship between Donovan and Ben's mother is. Like, how serious were these two? Fallon never seemed to pick up on what kind of relationship that he had with her. So why is this moment different? Why does this seem like it's out of character? Ultimately, it's because Hoover needed a reason for Ben to run into Donovan so that he could choose to follow Donovan and go to the same restaurant that Donovan was meeting Fallon at. And then Ben sits down at the adjacent table and starts listening into the conversation and actually does a pretty good job remembering and writing down all the dialogue that Fallon and Donovan had to the point where he must have had a tape recorder on him or something for this to be believable. Now, this is something that I did want to bring up before, but I didn't because I wanted this reveal to stand out on its own. In writing, there is a concept called in medias res, in the middle of things. It is one of my favorite ways to open a story. Now, there are multiple different ways that you can play around with in medias res. You could do like a flash forward or a, yep, that's me, you're probably wondering how I got here, sort of a setup.
This is me. I think it's apparent I need to rethink my life a little bit.
In discussing in medias res, one of my favorite examples is the game BioShock. In BioShock, you ride a bathysphere to this impossible city on the bottom of the ocean, the city of Rapture, and when you get there, it is this crumbling, decrepit drug den, which doesn't match the scene at all. It looks like it at one point was this immaculate, wonderful, high society place. What happened? While the main drive of the story is just your character trying to survive and get through the city in order to escape, you come across all these notes, all of these audio diaries. You get to observe the environment that you're in. And each little bit of that tells you a bit more about the city of Rapture, what it was beforehand and what it eventually turned into. You learn about the battle between Andrew Ryan and Freddie Fontaine, as Fontaine tried to overtake the city with his own corrupt gangster-style methods. You understand that Ryan was actually a hypocrite, as he did not really live up to the values that he claimed to portray or to fight for. And every little nugget of information is a gold mine of new references, new understandings for everything that the game is building up to this point. It is a wonderful experience because you get this, you start with this one interpretation, and it's so jarring that every bit of context, as you collect the audio diaries and you get more context for what's going on, it becomes a reason to explore all the maps and go around and find every little piece of information you can. And the information is good. You feel rewarded when you find a new audio diary, or you get a new bit of dialogue to consider. The interactions you have with the character Atlas is so engaging. And that is very much the opposite of what you get in this moment, because now we have come full circle. We are back at the beginning of the story and we get to see things from Ben's perspective, except now we know what he did. The story has been playing around with in medias res the entire time because Fallon had the fire 2 years before the start of the book, and that can be a way to use in medias res, except now everything is recontextualized. So the Hoover is clever in her execution of in medias res here. It's just that her characters are terrible and I hate them. Because now Ben does not come across as the selfless rando who just wanted to give Fallon a quick hand because her father was being kind of a dick. This is an arsonist who got away with it, who ruined a girl's life, and now feels bad about it and pushes himself on her without telling her who he is or what he did. In a more dramatic reading, this is a monster playing around with a victim. And we get another reference to Ben wondering about what kind of panties Fallon must have had on. And the entire time, like, Fallon goes up to go to the bathroom and Ben is checking her out, and when she comes back, he starts feeling so sorry for himself. She has no idea. She has no idea she's lifting her eyes and looking into the eyes of the guy who ruined her life. She has no idea that I would give anything to press my lips to that cheek, to kiss the scars I gave her, to tell her how incredibly sorry I am. She has no idea that I'm on the verge of tears just seeing her face, because it's equal parts exquisite and excruciating. I am afraid if I don't smile at her right now, I'll cry for her. Ben didn't set out to cause trouble, but he got so absorbed in the moment that he spread his pain with no justification and ruined Fallon's acting career and life. We don't even have any proof that Ben's mom knew Fallon's dad. In Joker, Arthur's mom wrote to Thomas Wayne frequently and actually did know him once, but the relationship she had in her head was largely a fantasy. The same could be happening here. Ben even realizes that his mom might not have loved this man because now that he thinks about it, he's not sure that she did. Donovan seemed to be the one sending all the letters and text messages.
You made them worse. Worse? Or better?
Ugh. Ben's perspective on everything warps what we originally thought was a good-natured attempt to help a stranger. Now we know it's a guilt-ridden attempt at penance that leads to a really, really selfish relationship full of dishonesty from the guy that ruined Fallon's life. We get up to the point where Ben is about to insert himself between Fallon and Donovan during the lunch date, and I don't like the way that Ben is framed here, because Ben comes off as a really obnoxious white knight to the point where, like, he is an unironic, fedora-tipping, milady sort of weirdo. You make me want to swear off men forever, she says. Hell, her father makes me want her to swear off men forever. If men are really as shallow as this one, all women should swear off men forever. And then Donovan drops the line about Fallon not being on a date since like 2 years ago. Ben reflects on, like, don't you realize what happened 2 years ago? Which is like, yeah, that is kind of weird, because an hour ago he was visiting the grave of the woman that I guess he was infatuated with. And this pisses Ben off so much that he might actually be angrier than the night he set the car on fire. And this, of course, is enough to push Ben to action. He's very upset. My hands are shaking. I'm so pissed. I think I might be angrier than the night I caught his car on fire. His house, Ben. Let's not split hairs here. You set his house on fire. And his daughter, for that matter. But then Ben just sits down next to Fallon, and we know where the story goes from there. Now, take a moment to consider. If you were in Fallon's position, what would you do? Would you read this and think, oh my God, finally, closure? Would you take this to the police? Because screw calling this a manuscript, I should have been calling this a confession. She actually has evidence that she might be able to use to get Ben, if not in jail, probably investigated. What would Ben do in that situation? Would he actually go along with it and say, yeah, that was me? Or would he be a coward and like try to deny everything and stay out of jail? The only thing left is a very lengthy letter from Ben to Fallon, and like he can try to say, I'm not trying to get you back, but this is absolutely him trying to get her back, with choice lines like this. But that first day I spent with you was the first day in a very long time that I felt happy, and I could tell that I made you happy, and that's something I never thought possible. Notice that Ben put himself first here. This was the first time I was happy, and also you were happy too. Considering that he put himself first here signifies that he was thinking about himself first and foremost. Ben is a deeply selfish person, and he again tries to emphasize that Fallon, has scars, but so what? And I mean, that's a nice sentiment that he's trying to build towards, but again, I think Hoover is trying to play with the idea that Ben is a very amateur writer because he describes it like this. And yes, you have scars, but anyone who sees your scars before they see you doesn't deserve you. I hope you remember that and believe that. A body is simply a package for the true gifts inside, and you are full of gifts. Selflessness, kindness, compassion, all the things that matter. And even though in his first letter Ben said, the best version of you doesn't include me, he finishes up this second letter by saying this. I know I said in my previous letter that I didn't write this for your forgiveness. While that's the truth, I'm not going to pretend that I'm not praying on my knees for your forgiveness, hoping for a miracle. I'm not going to act like I won't be sitting at the restaurant for hours upon end hoping you walk through those doors, because that's exactly where I'll be. And if you don't show up today, I'll be there next year and the next. Every November 9th, I'll wait for you, hoping one day you'll be able to find enough forgiveness to love me again. This guy cannot leave her alone. Ben is the sort of character who acts like no means yes. Like, if you're just persistent enough and you keep bothering the woman, she will eventually realize her mistake and will take you anyway. This is impressively fucked up. Like, this isn't as bad as the relationship in After, but oh my god, is this a mess. And the letter ends with Ben saying, you know, you can continue reading this manuscript. I guess there's more in it. I don't know. We don't get to see it. But Ben is going to be waiting in the restaurant for her, where I guess he headed straight to after he violated the restraining order and dropped it off at her apartment. You'd think they would kick him out after a while. Apparently they don't. And then for some reason, even though this is the same day, it says last November 9th, which would indicate that it's been a year, but it's not, because on the next page, it's Ben says, it's almost midnight. It's been 24 hours since I saw her pick up the manuscript and close her door. I guess Hoover just wanted to show off some more of this impressive poetry. If lies were written, I would erase them. But they are spoken, etched within. With convalesced truth, I scream out my atonement. Let me repent against your skin. Considering how self-centered and sexualized he's been so far, I think that this is Ben asking for a money shot. So Ben spends the entire day, almost a full 24 hours, in the restaurant feeling sorry for himself, when finally at 11:57, Fallon shows up and says, we only have 3 minutes to do this. And she's smiling. Fallon is an idiot. I'm honestly at a loss at this point. This is so confusing. Why? And Ben, in his neckbeard, incel, white knight, every pejorative in that regard I can think of way, starts crying that milady had granted him a wee bit of attention. And Fallon gives this... Fallon explains her side of things and why she has chosen to forgive Ben. And I'm sorry, but no. You were 16, she says. You had been through one of the worst things a child could ever experience. Your actions from that night weren't because you were a bad person, Ben. It was because you were a scared teenage boy, and sometimes people make mistakes. You've carried so much guilt for what you did, and for so long. You can't ask for my forgiveness because there's nothing to forgive. Shut the fuck up! If anything, I'm here for your forgiveness. Shut the fuck up! Because I know your heart, Ben, and your heart is only capable of love. I should have recognized that last year when I doubted you. I should have given you the chance to explain it then. If I had just listened to you, then we could have avoided an entire year of heartache. So for that, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, and I hope you can forgive me.
I hope you perish in flames.
The only way I would accept this scene would be if there was a twist that she was actually wearing a claymore on her chest and she just needed to get Ben in close for a hug. Oh, and apparently the reason she was showing up so late is because she got a tattoo. One on her wrist, books and theater, two of her favorite things. She got it when she realized how selflessly in love with Ben she was.
You ruined my life. What can I do for you?
I'm sorry, but the lengths you've got to go to, the amount of nonsense you've got to filter through in order for these two to still wind up together. This is such a leap in logic. Hoover wrote herself into an inescapable corner. She was not able to actually get her way out. So rather than come up with a creative solution or even go back and edit some of what she did so that it would come off as believable, she just barreled forward and had Fallon forgive Ben because that's just what the plot dictated. I'm sorry, but there is nothing in Fallon's character that would actually describe this, that would make this sound reasonable. When 50 Shades of Grey has a more grounded and realistic love story than yours, the magnitude by which you done fucked up. Oh my god. But they're not quite done. You see, Hoover has time for some next level top shelf cringe. Fallon says she'll come home with Ben, and he says, "Good," I tell her. "Tonight you're mine. I'll just wait to cook you breakfast until the day after tomorrow, and then every day after that until next November 9th, when I get down on one knee and give you the most book-worthy marriage proposal in history." She slaps me in the chest. "That was a huge spoiler, Ben. Did you not learn about spoiler alerts during your reading binge?" I grin as I lower my mouth to hers. Spoiler alert, they lived happily ever after. And then I kiss her, and it's a 12, not the end, far from it. This book has like a 4.1 on Goodreads, and I am confused as to why. This wasn't the worst romance I've ever read, but this is definitely not a good story. Hoover wrote the plot before she wrote her characters because the characters don't make sense considering who they are. Like, their actions don't make sense considering who they are and the situations they find themselves in. Fallon just forgave the guy who, in a moment of irrational nonsense, intentionally set her father's car on fire, which set her father's house on fire and ruined her acting career, which was her passion at the time. Ruined what would have otherwise been a very promising acting career. And she just forgave him because, well, I guess he's sorry. Ben's a criminal. He set someone's house on fire and never paid for it. In my view, a proper apology has two steps. Saying you're sorry, and then taking responsibility for your actions and trying to mitigate or undo the damage that you may have caused. And this could be something minor. Let's say you insult a friend, and as part of making it up to them, you try to alter your behavior so that you don't insult them again, or you crash a buddy's car and as a way of making it up to them, you pay for the damages. Ben has said sorry, but he has done nothing to redeem himself for the actions he committed. He hasn't paid for the car, he hasn't paid for the house, he hasn't done anything to help Fallon with her career, not really. I mean, yes, he was enthusiastic, "Go pursue your dream, girl, that's awesome," but that alone it cost him nothing. It took no effort. And Fallon, for some reason, just forgives him. And it doesn't make any sense. She was severely traumatized, at least by the fire, if not by the idea that she was in love with an arsonist. And yet, she goes back to him. 'Cause he said he was sorry really, really hard. Why would you crawl back to the boy who set you on fire and never confessed about it until he was forced to? This story is not about true love overcoming all obstacles. It was about obsessive feelings turning into love with a sprinkling of Stockholm Syndrome. And again, this is something that Nick Sparks, in all his repetitive glory, does so much better, because at least his characters make sense. Why am I using Nicholas Sparks as a benchmark for decent writing? God damn it. What was Hoover even aiming for with this book? This was like a thriller about some unhinged stalker that we're meant to read as a romance book. The victim forgives the stalker who pursued her for 6 years and traumatized her, ruined her career, and wouldn't take no for an answer. Ben is just about every negative stereotype about guys on the internet rolled into one. I know I keep bringing this up, but setting the house on fire was not a small mistake. Like, when you're a teenager, you're gonna do dumb things. You're going to make mistakes that, maybe they push things a little far. Maybe you back the car up into a flower garden and you ruin your mother's hard work, or you roughhouse inside a little too much and you break something. When I was a teenager, I tried to extinguish a wax candle, one of those big chamomile bucket candles to keep away bugs. Tried to extinguish it with a super soaker, ended up splashing into the wax, which caught on fire and created this huge fireball and spread wax all over the back deck. I had to scrape all the wax off with a chisel and then refinish all the wooden boards. What Ben did is significantly worse than all of that put together, and Hoover doesn't seem to be aware of that. I am so annoyed with this character. And Fallon is something of an object as well, because she exists just to reunite with Ben at the very end and forgive him. She is not a character at this point. She is an ancillary plot point for the sake of a happy ending. And none of the other side characters are all that engaging or compelling. Most of them aren't even that memorable. Can anyone tell me anything about Ben's oldest brother, Ian? While I haven't read any of Hoover's other books, I think I can safely conclude that she rushes her story. She'll come up with an idea for a plot, and then she'll just have the characters just kind of happen in the story and hope that it all fits together. And at least in this case, it really doesn't. When I watched Caleb Joseph's video on November 9, on Colleen Hoover, I believe he stated that November 9 was one of the worst books that he'd ever come across. Oh boy, I get it. He was right. Part of November 9's failure is how it plays with realism. Hoover made sure to include bits about writing cliches and Fallon's preferences for romances, and she mentioned key differences between romantic fantasies and real life. Those scenes work in the moment, but they unfortunately kill the overall value of the book as a whole, because you can't rely on romantic fantasy as an argument when complaining about this book. Twilight, 50 Shades, and even 365 Days can get away with this because they're so absurd in their own ways that they can only be seen as a fantasy. November 9 is like After in that way, since it's too removed from any fantastic elements, so it's more easily read as a down-to-earth story. That means that Ben's creepy nature is rewarded in the end, when really Fallon should have gone out and gotten an even harsher restraining order on the level of forcing Ben to leave the state. So yeah, I did not like this book. I don't understand why Hoover has the fans that she does, or why they aren't able to think critically and actually analyze this book for what it is. This is, in the end, rewarding terrible behavior. Ben threw a next level temper tantrum and in the end benefited from it. He got a happy ending because he set a house on fire. Does anyone not realize how fucked up that is? Anyway, so that's it for that. But the terrible romances will not end. Apparently that seems to be most of what I review on this channel now. I don't have a copy of it yet, but I'm actually working on 2 projects now. The first one being I'm taking another peek at Twilight's Breaking Dawn. You'll have to forgive me if that one takes a while. The book is really, really dense. But the other long-form review that I'm going to be hitting is going to be L. James returning to The Mister with a sequel that I didn't know she had room to write. The Misses is coming out on June 20th. I will start reading it shortly after that. Thank you for watching the video, everyone. I hope you enjoyed watching my mental health descend into madness while my voice deteriorates to the point where I can never hope to have a career as an opera singer. And big thank you to my patrons for the continued support. It means a lot, and I hope a good number of you become very successful authors in the future. And special thank you to Mint Mobile for not just partnering with the channel and supporting us that way, but for providing great service at very, very, very affordable rates. I have a pit in my soul that can only be filled by corporate payouts. And despite my jokes about my mental health, don't worry, I'm fine. I have plenty of palate cleansers.